All of these, we understand, played an intimate role in at the bequest of the White House to rubber stamp the lease on Floyd Bennett Field. While I realize that we provided a little over a week's notice, I expect that the DOI and National Park Service officials who signed off on a state of emergency would want to urgently discuss that matter with Congress and the American public. We noticed this hearing on the first business day after the lease was signed. With that being said, we will use all available tools at the discretion of the committee to compel them to discuss this matter with us and the American people in the near future. I do want to thank the witnesses who agreed to testify before us today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Our witnesses are the Honorable Joanne Areola, New York City Council member for the 32nd District, the Honorable Jamie Williams, New York State Assembly member for the 59th District, Ms. Eleanor Acer, Senior Director of Refugee Protection at Human Rights First, and Mr. Kenneth Spencer, Chairman of the United States Park Police Fraternal Order of Police. Now, let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the on button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. The chair now recognizes Councilwoman Areola for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Chair, as well as the members of the committee. The primary duty of the National Park Service is to protect the national parks and the national monuments under its jurisdiction and keep them as nearly in their natural state as this can be done in view of the fact that access to them must be provided in order that they may be used and enjoyed. These words were written by Stephen Mather, the first director of the National Park Service back in 1925. For much of the last century, they have held true until now. With the offering and signing of the lease at Floyd Bennett Field, the federal government is going directly against what Mather and countless other officials through the decades have repeatedly said should be the primary duty of the National Park Service. Rather than providing access to this national park space, the federal government is restricting the ability of the public to fully enjoy the 1,300 acres of parkland on the shores of Jamaica Bay. Instead of enabling public access, the National Park Service is instead agreeing to house 2,000 people on the former runway of this aviation landmark. Not only is this decision to house thousands of people a violation of the founding ideals of the National Park Service, but is also a violation of the agreement made to establish the Gateway National Recreation Area as well. On September 26th of 1972, then Congressman Frank Brasco made it clear why this site is incompatible with any plans for housing at this location. There are no sewers, no sidewalks, no curbs, no streets. There are no schools, no medical facilities, or houses of worship. Floyd Bennett Field is totally filled land with water 8 feet below the surface. Transportation facilities are virtually non-existent, and the nearest subway is 4 miles from the site. A single bus route now serves the area. The congressman also explained that New York City faces a serious lack of open recreation space, and Floyd Bennett Field would provide that access to open green spaces for countless residents of Brooklyn, Queens, and beyond. Thanks to Congressman Brasco's argument, a state proposal constructing housing at Floyd Bennett Field was removed, and by a vote of 76-13, Floyd Bennett Field was made a part of the Gateway National Recreation Area. Today, the situation is not much different than it was back in 1972. The closest subway station is still 4 miles away. The area still has no schools, medical facilities, houses of worship, and is still only served by one bus line. What has changed, however, is that the park now welcomes as many as 1 million people per year to enjoy its open spaces and programmed events. It also is home to specialized NYPD units, a training facility for the Department of Sanitation, and even a Marine Reserve unit, among other assets. All of these stand to be disrupted by the placement of 2,000 people, or if the mayor's office is to be believed, as many as 7,500 people in the area. The decision to house thousands of people at this site has also been done without following the proper protocols necessary for such an endeavor. Namely, the decision is being pursued without following the federally mandated NEPA process. Pursuant to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, federal law requires agency decision makers make informed decisions via a codified system of studies, assessments, and input sessions. And the NEPA handbook itself states clearly, actions taken in response to an emergency are not exempt to NEPA review. Therefore, the NEPA process must be complete before any agency makes a final decision on the proposed action. This was not done. Additionally, there was no process of public notice, effectively shutting out the ability of local community to voice their concerns about this sudden and radical change to their local parkland. This has effectively turned our national parks, something Wallace Stanger once said was the best idea we ever had, an absolutely American, absolutely democratic, into something that's entirely undemocratic indeed. Already we have seen programming that should have taken place at Floyd Bennett Field be canceled to accommodate this base camp. Already an art festival from Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy has been scrapped, and we can be sure that additional planned events will follow. The placement of the migrant base camp at Floyd Bennett Field flies in the face of the founding ideals of the National Park Service and erodes the democratic underpinnings that have been the hallmark of our parks since their inception. For these reasons, it is vital that the federal government revoke the lease for Floyd Bennett Field and enable the public to fully use this space, just as they have continually done since 1972. Thank you for the time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Assemblywoman Williams for 5 minutes.
Is it on? Okay, good morning, Chair and Ranking Chair. In recent weeks, the Governor of New York State and the Mayor of New York City proposed a plan to use our national park, Floyd Bennett Field, via the Biden administration to temporarily house migrants have become a great concern for our community. Please let me share some of these concerns. This past weekend, there was almost 5 inches of water covering runway 19, the exact location proposed for housing the migrants. This is not an isolated event, but rather a frequent occurrence. This serves as a stark reminder to the potential dangers of Floyd Bennett Field. In addition, it's a transit desert and has no infrastructure, no plumbing, no electricity, no sewage system. As you may know, SECA mandates a rigorous review of environmental, social, economic impacts for any project. However, in this particular case, it is evident that due diligence was not executed in compliance with SECA's multi-step decision process. This non-compliance not only negates the law, but also risks unforeseen detrimental consequences on multiple fronts, including the socioeconomic well-being of the local residents, of the environmental sanctity of the area. The failure to adhere to NEPA regulations further illuminates the glaring shortcomings in evaluating the proposed plan. NEPA's binding regulations are designed to safeguard against environmentally detrimental proposals, ensuring the preparation of environmental impact statement. The absence of these critical assessments raises grave concerns about the underlying environmental sustainability and safety of relocating migrants to this area. Floyd Bennett Field, a national park, is a treasure of natural beauty and biodiversity. Housing individuals here is equivalent to tarnishing the sanctity of Yellowstone National Park. The irreversible damage of flora and fauna and the destruction of our natural beauty are contrary to the ethos of conservation and preservation that national parks symbolize. The 1972 decision by Congress against the housing plan on Floyd Bennett Field, based on its inadequacy for residents, must not be overlooked. This historical precedent serves as a legislative evidence of the sustainability of the area. Revisiting and overturning such well-founded decisions without adequate reassessment suggests a lack of prudence and disregard for established legislation. Migrants, many of whom have already faced immense suffering, are entitled to a safe and secure living environment. Placing them in a flood-prone area during an active hurricane season, as well as colder months ahead, is neither humane nor ethical. The proposal not only risks the safety of the migrants, but also impacts the welfare and quality of life of the local residents surrounding Floyd Bennett Field. It is crucial to consider the cumulative implications to the community, which will have to bear the brunt of the socioeconomic and environmental disruptions. In conclusion, on behalf of every resident of the 5th Ninth Assembly District, I ask the dedicated members of this Committee of Natural Resources to take these points into consideration and reject this proposal. Please reflect on our commitment to uphold the principles of our environmental stewardship, legislative compliance, ethical responsibility, and humanitarian compassion. Together with your support, we will continue to ensure that our national park and its historic sites will be preserved for future generations to come. Thank you.
Assemblywoman Williams, thank you for your testimony, as well as Councilwoman Areola, thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Acer for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Eleanor Acer, and I'm Senior Director for Refugee Protection at Human Rights First. My testimony today is going to focus on some of the key steps that the Biden administration and Congress should take to ensure and sustain humane, legal, and orderly processes as U.S. communities, both at the border and across the country, receive migrants and people seeking asylum. Key steps include to significantly improve access to work permits, to increase critical funding to support reception in border and destination communities, to properly resource humanitarian aid, resettlement, safe shelter, asylum and immigration court adjudications in the United States, and to reject and counter dangerous rhetoric painting migrants and asylum seekers as threats or invaders. In recent years, the human rights situation in many countries in the Americas have deteriorated, pushing people to flee in search of protection, safety, and stability. In reality, though, the vast majority of the world's refugees are hosted by countries other than the United States. 6 million of the 7.3 million, now I think nearly 7.7 million, that have fled from Venezuela are in other countries, in Colombia, in Brazil, Peru, Costa Rica, and other places in Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States is more than capable of humanely receiving and fairly processing the claims of people seeking asylum. The steps outlined in my testimony today are crucial to doing so. First, the prompt provision of work permits is critical to supporting U.S. communities, as well as for migrants and asylum seekers to support themselves and their families. The reality is that immigrants have always been and always will be a boon to New York City and the nation. In a letter to President Biden and congressional leaders, over 100 executives of major corporations explained that there are labor shortages in many U.S. industries, and there's a compelling need for expedited processing of asylum applications and work permits. Last week, the Biden administration announced important steps to improve work authorization processing, as well as to designate and extend TPS for Venezuelans, moves that will help more people to work, house, and support themselves more quickly. But more action is needed, as outlined in my written testimony. Second, Congress should increase shelter and support program funding and increase funding to all cities receiving migrants and asylum seekers through the Aspire Act, which we urge you all to support. Third, the Biden administration should also double down on some of the effective, humane, and legal policies that it has already initiated or announced, and reject those that punish, ban, and block people seeking asylum. I've laid out some key steps along these lines in my testimony, and I'm happy to talk about this later further. Congressional support is essential to assure the appropriations needed to implement effective solutions. By contrast, the failure of Congress to appropriate necessary resources, including via a government shutdown, is sure to thwart orderly migration management and adjudications. It's deeply concerning to see many of the most harmful and ineffective policies from recent years included in legislation passed by the House, called the Secure Border Act of 2023. It's a patchwork of extreme anti-immigrant proposals that would shut down the U.S. asylum system and target families and children. Policies that ban, block, and turn away people seeking asylum are not a solution. They're actually part of the problem. The crisis we are facing is a global humanitarian crisis. Other nations, including those with far less resources, are welcoming and hosting the overwhelming majority of the world's refugees. We can and must do better, and I look forward to discussing this with you further.
Ms. Acer, thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Spencer for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, and members of the Natural Resources Committee. My name is Kenneth Spencer, and my testimony this morning is delivered in my capacity as Chairman of the United States Park Police Fraternal Order of Police. Simply put, our organization represents the interests of approximately 350 sworn law enforcement officers of the United States Park Police. I am honored to be here today and very thankful for this opportunity to share officer safety concerns regarding the proposed migrant shelter facilities on Floyd Bennett Field. On average, U.S. Park Police officers protect 160,000 daily visitors to our national parks in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and New York City, patrolling a geographic area of over 30,000 acres and more than 75 miles of highway. Notably, we are the world's leading law enforcement agency when it comes to supporting large-scale special events and other First Amendment activities. Despite our sweeping law enforcement jurisdiction across Floyd Bennett Field and the surrounding communities, the September 15th, 2023 lease agreement between the Interior Department and the City of New York, 61 pages in all, includes only one reference to the United States Park Police, which restates our role as the primary entity responsible for law enforcement issues outside of the camp perimeter within the boundaries of the park area. Tellingly, the National Park Service never consulted with our agency or our officers to collaborate on law enforcement concerns or operational implementation. Let me be perfectly clear. Even without the migrant shelter on Floyd Bennett Field, we are at least 300 officers short of our required minimum level. Our capacity to serve and protect the public today is literally bursting at the seams. The idea that the U.S. Park Police is prepared to address 2,000 new migrants left under tents with nothing to do and no ability to communicate is not only imprudent, but it is also perilous. The proposed migrant shelter on Floyd Bennett Field falls under the jurisdiction of our Jamaica Bay Station unit. As of today, there are 25 sworn officers assigned to this unit. Typically, there are only 2 officers on duty per shift. I think that's worth restating. Under the officer staffing levels that exist today, just 2 police officers will be responsible for all the law enforcement matters outside of the tent. The impact of this staffing reality is undeniable. The surrounding public, our officers, and the migrants themselves will face significant safety risks 24/7. In addition to the extreme shortages of our officers, the Jamaica Bay unit does not have any of the modern facilities that would be needed to provide law enforcement services surrounding the migrant camp. For example, we have 1 holding cell for prisoner processing. Our station phones and computers are at best unreliable, and the station is left unstaffed most of the day. Windows to the station are unsecured and accessible on the ground level from the outside of the station. To my knowledge, the National Park Service has no plans to address or fix any of this in advance of the migrants moving in. In fact, the NPS superintendent of Gateway National Recreation Area refused to request any funds for the United States Park Police under the terms of this lease agreement. Even if one were to ignore the officer staffing shortages in the dilapidated station facilities, as New York City and the Park Service have done, I have many grave concerns about our agency's readiness to protect the public and the migrants themselves. For example, will the Park Service provide us full-time translators to facilitate communications? What will be the processing protocols for arrests? How can we protect migrants from the dangerous currents in Jamaica Bay, the toxic areas containing discarded radioactive materials, and abandoned buildings where homeless are known to congregate? What protections are in place for the adjacent youth sports center, bird watching sanctuaries, fishing areas, and children's petting zoo? I'm not a lawyer, but under these knowingly dangerous conditions, I can only imagine the number of lawsuits the Park Service might face. Our officers are truly passionate about serving the public throughout the communities under our 3 jurisdictions. Unfortunately, the National Park Service appears all too willing to erect these migrant camps in a region that is entirely unprepared to mitigate against the safety risks. My testimony this morning is not one of politics or public policy regarding migrants. Indeed, the law enforcement concerns I speak of today are all too real, dangerous, and irresponsible. Regrettably, I fear for the safety of our officers, the public, and the migrants themselves. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this testimony today on behalf of the United States Park Police officers, and I welcome any questions the committee may have.
Mr. Spencer, thank you for your testimony and for your service. The chair will now recognize members for 5 minutes each for questions. We'll begin with the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you for talking about the positive solutions the Republican conference has put forward, like H.R. 2, addressing this serious problem. Gateway National Recreation Area was created by Congress in 1972 with, quote, the dream of bringing a national park experience to the New York metropolitan area. Think about that, bringing a national park experience to the New York metropolitan area. But what we have under the Biden administration is exactly the opposite. It's bringing a New York metropolitan experience to the national parks. And I shouldn't be surprised about the hypocrisy of the Biden administration. The purpose of the Bureau of Land Management, for instance, is to maintain working land, but a few weeks ago we found out that the Biden administration wants to lock up working land under conservation easements. The purpose of a resource management plan is to manage public resources, but the BLM in Colorado, my state, has proposed a withdrawal of 1.6 million acres of land that was adequately planned and prepared under a resource management plan. So now to the topic at hand, the National Park Service in New York City wants to house thousands of migrants on park land. Ms. Areola, I have a question for you. Does the general management plan for Gateway National Recreation Area include provisions for migrant housing?
At a recent hearing last Thursday discussing the migrant crisis and different HERCs and shelters, I directly asked the administration if there was a plan in place if the national park at Floyd Bennett Field should become a migrant base camp. The first answer was, it's evolving.
So
When I pushed further-
no, they don't have an existing,
Correct.
yeah.
When I pushed further, the answer was no.
Thank you. And so where did they get the authority to house migrants on Park Service land, not to mention the arbitrary waiving of environmental regulations?
Without a proper plan in place, this would never work. It's an ill-conceived plan, and there are no measures that are being taken place. This is an area that does not have any sewer system, so therefore anything that's brought in, sewer and provisions have to be brought in. And it doesn't have any type of water source. Okay. So you'd have to bring water in, but you can't have propane tanks.
Thank you.
So it would be cold water.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to my next question. Section 8623 of the 2018 Farm Bill allows the Forest Service to lease federal land for administrative functions. We're wondering in Colorado if that includes temporary housing for agency employees. So Ms. Acer, I have a question for you. Do you believe that administrative site leasing or employee housing should be construed to be open to housing migrants?
Thank you very much, Congressmember. I'm actually not an expert on parks or the law that governs them, and I'm here today to talk about solutions relating to protecting people seeking asylum in the United States. So I do not have that expertise, but
So you can't speak as to whether this could become a template for other parks all over the United States and the other 49 states?
No, I really would like to stick to the areas that I know best because I'm testifying in front of Congress and really do want to be completely accurate. Thank you,
Okay,
sir.
well, thank you. But that is a big concern to us. I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on that. My next question, in October 2021, Eric Adams, mayor of New York City, stated, quote, "We should protect our immigrants, period. Yes, New York City will remain a sanctuary city under an Adams administration," end quote. However, you see the quote behind me here. He said, "This issue will destroy New York City." So a lot can change in 2 years. Mrs. Williams, I have a question for you. What do you think changed the mayor's mind over the last 2 years?
I guess we have to ask the mayor himself, but that is the current issue at hand, and as we come before you, as we come before you, it's about Floyd Bennett Field, our national park. The mayor, he would have to answer that question. He said what he said, but on this day, we are here to talk about the misuse or the intent to house 2,000 plus single men at Floyd Bennett Field, our national park.
And my concern is that New York City, a wealthy part of our country, if it's having trouble with this housing crisis, what about all the other communities around the country in our border states or other states? How are they going to be able to cope?
Absolutely. I don't have the answer for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlemen, as time has expired, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a lot of folks at home, especially if they've followed the work of this committee for the last 9 months, are probably pretty confused. Why are we here in the Natural Resources Committee talking about the migrant challenges we face, the asylum system being overwhelmed because of a complex set of issues that Ms. Acer talked about? Why is that happening here in the Natural Resources Committee? Why do we have Republicans who have spent the last 9 months, and in some cases their entire careers, slashing the budgets of the National Park System and the Interior Department, suddenly today gravely concerned about the integrity of our National Park System? Why do we have Republicans who have spent the last 9 months attacking our bedrock environmental laws, trying to undermine them in every way possible, suddenly urging more aggressive enforcement of our environmental laws? Why is all of this happening? Well, Team Extreme and the MAGA chaos agents that control this narrow, dysfunctional Republican majority are 3 days away from shutting down the government. Welcome to the distraction. They don't want to talk about what that's going to do to the National Park System. They don't want to talk about what that's going to do to the Border Patrol agents and asylum workers and everyone else who is trying to deal with a really difficult challenge. They want to change the subject. And so you see all of this stagecraft and theater and vitriol because nothing induces hyperventilation and internet clicks and distraction like their favorite narrative. Now, 1 week ago, this hearing was supposed to be a markup. So why are Interior Department officials not here? Because 1 week ago, they were busy filling up their calendars with real work. But something changed as we got closer to that MAGA government shutdown. A distraction was needed, and so this hearing was quickly repurposed to an oversight hearing about something that you have to stretch and strain the jurisdiction of this committee to even be talking about. That is why we are here. And it's also popular. We've got Republican members waving on to this committee to be part of it. Isn't that interesting? Now, why New York City? I don't really think of most of my Republican colleagues as caring much about New York City most of the time. But the fact is, this narrow, dysfunctional Republican majority runs through the state of New York. And right now, because of a series of unfortunate events, some Republicans managed to get themselves elected to Congress, and they are about to be held accountable for the chaos and dysfunction of this crazy Republican majority and the government shutdown that we're 3 days away from bringing. and they need some air cover. They need a distraction. And so that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this unlikely issue, and that's why it is centered in, of all places, New York City. It's about distraction and air cover. So, Ms. Acer, I want to thank you for providing the broader context for this conversation. I want to thank you for the incredible work that you do for human rights. And I want to shed a little light on the issue that our Republican colleagues don't want to talk about, and that is all the stuff that's going to happen 3 days from now when they shut down the government. Could you speak a little bit to the inevitable impacts of a government shutdown when it comes to the folks who are straining to deal with this overwhelming situation of providing humanitarian treatment of asylees, processing asylum claims? I mean, for goodness sake, all these folks, including the Border Patrol agents that have the tough job of dealing with both legal and illegal border crossings, they're about to start going without pay because of this MAGA government shutdown. Could you speak a little bit to what that means for the issues that you're working on?
Certainly. Thank you, Congressmember. A government shutdown would be disastrous and would undermine the U.S. ability to manage migration and refugee protection at home and regionally. A shutdown will in particular wreak havoc on the immigration courts. Back when there was a government shutdown back in 2019, some of you may know, 80 to 94,000 cases had to be canceled and put off for years. And those cancellations and adjournments added to the backlog that had already been existing.
How about the National Park Unit we're talking about here today?
I think I would defer to Mr. Spencer on the details of how something like this would impact the national parks, but I did hear him talk about resource issues. Yeah. In addition to the immigration courts, we also have real concerns about the impact that a shutdown could have on many of the critical services that are conducted day in and day out by humanitarian organizations that are helping to welcome people seeking asylum. We really urge that steps be taken to ensure that does not happen, because that would really be a disaster for U.S. communities.
Thank you, Ms. Acer. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentlemen's time's expired, and I was reminded during that round of questioning about how it was a Republican-led initiative on the Great American Outdoors Act that put $6.5 billion into the National Park Service, signed by President Trump. So thank you for that reminder. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, for the record, the Constitution was America's best idea. The national parks were one of our better ideas, and the Democrats' open border policy is clearly and unquestionably America's worst idea. Since Biden took office, that policy has produced the deliberate release into our country, in direct violation of federal law, 2.6 million illegal immigrants. Our law requires that every asylum seeker be detained until their asylum claim is adjudicated. That law is being ignored. Now, by the way, that's the population of the state of West Virginia. And while the Border Patrol's been overwhelmed dealing with that, another 1.7 million known gotaways have illegally entered our country as well. That's an additional illegal population the size of New Mexico. So in the last 34 months, the Democrats have admitted 2 new states into the country the size of West Virginia and New Mexico, virtually all of them destitute, desperate, and dependent. They've migrated to sanctuary cities like New York, and that the hypocrisy of declaring yourself a sanctuary city where illegal immigration is welcomed and encouraged, and then protesting the result of that is the ultimate comic tragedy. Now, Mayor Adams has complained that the 110,000 migrants in his city will destroy it. And he blames Texas. Well, Texas is responsible for sending about 15,000 illegal immigrants with their consent to New York. But as Governor Abbott just pointed out, all the rest were sent by Joe Biden, once Biden allowed all of them into the country in the first place. And of course, we have the same problem in California. New York and California voters overwhelmingly voted for Biden and the Democrats. So, folks, sorry, but you get the government you vote for. And when you voted for the Democrats, this is exactly what you voted for. And if you're surprised by this, you weren't paying any attention. You know, as Abraham Lincoln said it, the voters are everything. If they get their backsides too close to the fire, they'll just have to sit on the blisters a while. That might be painful, but hopefully it's a learning experience. Or as Cicero put it, I don't blame Caesar, I blame those who cheered for Caesar. So the issue is not where this unprecedented illegal mass migration is being settled. The issue is that this administration, the people that have been elected to it, have not only allowed it, but have actively encouraged it. Not as a matter of incompetence, or as the chairman called it, a mistake. They've done it methodically and deliberately. And this is going to continue until the people responsible for these policies have been turned out of office, and you've already heard from a few of them today. The issue goes far beyond the decision to turn our national parks into migrant camps. Explain to me how we make our communities safer by making it all but impossible to deport criminal illegal aliens and instead release them back into our communities. This is a central function of sanctuary cities, which New Yorkers have happily voted themselves to be. How do we protect our citizens by inviting the criminal cartels to set up shop in our communities and then flood them with fentanyl and other lethal drugs? How do we make our schools better by packing our classrooms with non-English speaking students? How do we strengthen the social safety net for Americans by admitting millions of impoverished, homeless, and destitute people into our country? How do we make our hospitals more accessible by cramming them with illegals demanding uncompensated care? How do we improve the wages for working Americans by flooding the labor market with cheap illegal labor? History is screaming this warning at us that countries that either cannot or will not secure their borders simply aren't around very long. Without borders, we have no country. We've simply become a vast, lawless, plundered international territory between Canada and Mexico. You know, we'd finally secured our borders during the Trump administration. Trump's Remain in Mexico policy all but brought phony asylum claims to a standstill. The border wall was nearing completion, and court-ordered deportations were being enforced. On his first day in office, Biden reversed those policies and has produced the worst illegal mass migration in history. The bill passed by the House of Representatives, H.R. 2, would restore our borders, but the Democrats are blocking it in the Senate, and Biden's vowed to veto it. And that's the real issue, and that's the issue at the center of this hearing. Mr. Huffman made it clear that the Democrats consider this crisis a mere distraction. I wonder if the people might have a different opinion. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the committee is holding a disingenuous hearing under the guise of protecting National Park Service land. This is ironic, considering that the Republican Party is currently fighting to cut the NPS budget by approximately $500 million in the Interior Appropriations Bill, and is pushing our country toward a disastrous government shutdown that will furlough many NPS employees and disrupt the maintenance of parks across the country. This politically charged stunt to distract from the fact that Republicans have no solution to avoiding a shutdown, just as they have no real solutions to the situation in New York City. Please, don't come here and kid ourselves. This is not about national parks. This is about their inability to govern. Politicians from states like New York, like Texas and Florida have fueled this emergency and manufactured a crisis that local, state, and federal officials will be forced to solve. Instead of bickering about what the demand of the day is, to fund the government and avoid a shutdown, we need Republicans in Congress to come to the table and work with us to fix this through real substantive immigration reform. And to not do so is basically looking for a political talking point to attack cities like New York, not simply yelling and screaming over a lack of border security. As one of the 2 New Yorkers on this committee, I am deeply disturbed by this hearing because I know firsthand that the situation in New York City is a humanitarian crisis and not a partisan issue. New York City, let me just make sure that people fleeing violence and persecution, regardless of nationality or other demographics, can access functioning asylum and refugees resettlement system in this country. New York City is doing all it can to accomplish this, but they cannot do it alone. Asylum seekers deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, not treated as political pawns to tout anti-immigration rhetoric, which is deeply rooted in racism and xenophobia. At every step, Republicans have made this crisis worse. It is time for us to put politics aside and address this issue head on. Ms. Acer, in a podcast conversation with reporter Errol Lewis, a New York City Republican candidate for mayor suggested housing migrants at Rikers Island, the city's central jail. Can you explain the dangers of ostracizing asylum seekers in a facility normally used to contain individuals who have broken the law?
Thank you very much, Congressmember, for that question. Over many years of doing this work, both as an individual lawyer representing asylum seekers, and since then, I've visited many of the immigration jails in this country where we send people seeking asylum. I've been to the detention centers where families are held and heard about how difficult it was for them to be held in these facilities. I've spoken to people who came to this country because they believed in freedom, because they believed in what this country stood for, and they were shocked again and again to find themselves handcuffed and shackled when they asked for protection, sent to immigration jails, and left in prison uniforms, often for long periods of time, denied release, even if they have family members or friends in this country sometimes. Sending people seeking refuge to immigration jails or Rikers Island is definitely not an answer. Right? I outlined in my paper many solutions that really are effective.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from American Samoa, Ms. Rodaway, for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chairman and ranking member for holding this hearing today. I want to start by saying that by no means should we turn a blind eye to refugees in need. Despite some of the rhetoric that gets thrown around when discussing this sensitive issue, I'm sure none of my colleagues are suggesting anything so cold-hearted. However, I say this as someone from a culture of hospitality, charity, and service. If your own house isn't in order, you're no help to anyone. In addition to the very real and very practical concerns over the campsite in question, I want to point out that our colleagues over in the Judiciary Committee have been struggling with DHS over their ability, or perhaps it's better to say inability, to process migrant paperwork. The people who come to this country deserve dignity and a fair chance at the American dream, but some of the administration's policies are proving to be counterproductive to that goal. A mismanaged house quickly becomes run down and provides no shelter to anyone. President Biden's reckless border policies are turning every city in America into a border city, and the impacts are undeniable in New York City. Today, we gave the administration an opportunity to come before the committee and answer to the American people regarding their failed immigration policies. Unfortunately, as you can see, President Biden is not interested in transparency and accountability when it comes to the southern border and the migrant crisis in New York City. Councilmember Areola and Assemblywoman Williams, if we had an administration official here today, what would be your message to them?
I would say that the use of our national park is not up for grabs. And I'm saying this to you right now, that this Floyd Bennett Field is located on the south side, the southeast side of Brooklyn. It is a bipartisan fight that you're seeing here. I am sorry that we are in the crossfire between what the Republicans are doing and the Democrats, but that is not the purpose why we are here. We are here to protect our national park that has become a place of interest to house 2,000 plus migrants into our backyard that is used by our constituents and throughout the state. It has become a very local issue. So I would say there was no public hearing, and I would ask on behalf of every one of my constituents and every American citizen that believe and visit our national park to please withdraw this lease. Thank you.
Ms. Areola?
Thank you. What I would say is New York is in trouble. When you have a Democratic mayor who was welcoming migrants only a year ago, saying that it's going to destroy New York City, and a Democratic governor saying, if you're leaving your country, go somewhere else, that they're not Republicans. Those are Democrats. This is a bipartisan issue that's happening in New York City. We have 206 shelters. It costs us $383 per day per migrant to house them. We're now looking at national parks, which means we're at our borders here. We cannot sustain it anymore. All of our hotels, any available housing, are full. They're full to capacity. It's 120,000+ migrants that have come into New York without the walkaways. We're seeing more and more people living on the streets. This is not humanitarian. We need to do something. So what's happening now? Our governor has asked for the use of our natural resources, our parks, the things that we all in this committee stand to protect. That's why this committee is here. We talk about protected lands. We talk about endangered species. We talk about climate change. But none of that matters at Floyd Bennett Field or Fort Wadsworth or Fort Tilden or at any of the gateway recreational areas. This is not about crossfire, as my colleague said. This is about putting 2,000 to 7,500 human beings on a property that floods regularly and is covered when we do have a climate incident like Sandy. It is not a place that can house long-term residents, and it cannot house short-term residents. It doesn't have any type of police force. We talked about NPS and their inability to provide services. So does the NYPD have a less a head count as the FDNY. The mayor's management report stated that both those agencies have had higher response times. What will happen if we do get hit with a hurricane? We have to evacuate the entire Rockaway Peninsula, all of the Brooklyn portion of the borough, and we have to pass by Floyd Bennett Field. Floyd Bennett Field isn't even an option for the residents to go to for safety when there is a climate emergency. So it's not about politics today. It is about our national resources. It's about opening a door to our national parks that can then set a precedent to happen in each and every one of the national parks in each and every one of your states. And it's also placing migrants in a place where they would not be safe. And we are in agreement on that. And that is a bipartisan agreement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to emphasize some of the remarks that the Ranking Member Grijalva made in the opening of this hearing, which is really lining out the differences between the folks who are identifying solutions and those who are not. I'd like to submit to the congressional record, rather the record of the committee, two statements from what is known as the Common Sense Caucus in the New York City Council, I believe of which Councilmember Areola is a member. The first is a statement on the migrant crisis, and the second is a statement on Secretary Mayorkas as well.
Without objection.
Now, Councilmember Areola, it says here, that you've got, this statement is in opposition to work permits and work authorizations for newly arrived asylees. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you are in opposition, and in this letter, it says, quote unquote, the migrants who have recently arrived in New York should follow the lawful immigration process. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
Are you aware that seeking asylum is a lawful immigration process?
When it is deemed to be asylum.
Yes.
It has not yet been deemed to be
And
asylum seekers.
are you aware that you have to arrive in the United States in order to apply for asylum, correct?
That is
So
correct.
arrival is also part of that lawful process. I'd like to highlight that. And so when we oppose work authorization, we have folks who are opposing the ability for people who are seeking a lawful process to support themselves, who don't want to be a strain on public systems. And we've got folks who want to block people from being able to follow the same American dream that almost every person here, their family comes from. Folks coming here with nothing but the shirt on their back and getting a job and supporting a family. We've got folks who want to deny that. On the federal level, we have folks who oppose comprehensive immigration reform. We're cutting funding, not just to our national park services, but to our overall supportive services. We're on the brink of a shutdown right now so that none of these things can get processed in the first place. And then, while we're in this process of opposing work authorizations, I think it's important to note that these systems are being overwhelmed in the first place because of large parts of contributions to solve this problem. If we are serious about addressing this issue, we need to also make sure that we're opening and allowing people to be documented. And I can't for the life of me understand why there is such partisan opposition to doing this. I mean, truly. And in addition to that, we also need to be assessing the foreign policy decisions that we are making that are driving people to our southern border in the first place. There is so much rhetoric out here blaming other countries and their dysfunctions for why people are coming to the United States when we are engaging in interventionist policy abroad and when our sanctions in Latin America are part of the picture here. So we're either going to agree to those things and take on the responsibility of the consequences, or we're going to reassess our policy. It is outrageous to be using the city of New York, where, by the way, these asylum seekers, their kids are enrolling in school. Those who can seek work are doing it right away. That, by the way, they're trying to fill labor needs that we have long had as a city and state. We should be paving the pathways to make this as easy as possible. And perhaps we wouldn't need, and perhaps there wouldn't be a Floyd Bennett Field situation if people were actually supporting a smooth system here. Assemblymember Williams, I didn't hear in your testimony, I understand the concerns you're raising about the field. I didn't hear in your testimony the alternative sites you've advocated for. Could you remind me of which those are?
The alternative sites to house migrants?
The alternative site to Floyd Bennett Field.
Well, in the conversation, as we know,
I'm sorry, I only have 18 seconds. Which are the sites that you propose as an alternative?
I don't have a proposal.
So you don't have a proposal alternative? No proposed alternative. No solutions here. No ideas here. But Democrats, we're authorizing 500,000 work permits so people can get on their feet and support themselves. Democrats, we're proposing comprehensive immigration reform. Democrats, we're talking about saying, let's reassess our foreign policies so that people aren't fleeing and making sure that we aren't participating in the destabilization of what's happening abroad. And all I'm hearing right now is that we're not being met in the middle. No support, no path to citizenship, no identified alternatives, just grievances. We need to get it together and make sure that we're getting on the right page. And if the ideas being presented here in this committee are being disagreed with, I'd like to see some actual functional alternatives that center and preserve the dignity of both people who are coming here to fulfill an American dream and the American citizens here who want to support them. And with that, I yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time's
Chair.
expired. The chair now recognizes,
Chair, may I just respond with permission, please?
maybe the next person asking a question will yield you time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll just right out of the chute agree with my colleague from New York. We need to get it together on the border where it starts. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for doing this today, for your leadership on this. Just for the public record, point out that it's a Republican chair of Natural Resources that is the one bringing this forward. I'm going to guess that the mayor of New York, Mr. Adams, wasn't thinking that Chairman Westerman was going to be his ally within the last year, but here we are. So thank you for your leadership, Mr. Chairman. Whether we like it or not, we are in a war, and we're in a war on the southern border with the cartels. I'm from Idaho, not exactly a border state. Southern border anyway. We have a northern border. But in the state of Idaho, for the first time in our state's history, fentanyl convictions have surpassed convictions related to methamphetamine. I don't have the numbers in front of me for fentanyl-related deaths, but it's off the charts, comparatively speaking. Last year, local police in Idaho, in the central part of the state, small town, recovered 30,000 fentanyl pills from one person. And that's in central Idaho. It's a long way from the southern border, but that's where they came from. Not only is the fentanyl epidemic impacting cities across the country, but it's killing our next generation. So, but this is not a priority for this administration. And Ms. Williams, I was looking at your testimony and listening to you, and welcome to our world. The administration is from your party. This is what we're struggling with. For the month of September, we're about to break an all-time record of apprehensions on the southern border, and we wonder why this is a problem. Mrs. Areola, in your testimony, you spoke out against using Floyd Bennett Field as a shelter for migrants. Not only does it violate your sovereignty, but it certainly, in my opinion, it placates the problem we have on the southern border. How many constituents do you represent in New York, about?
Just shy of 170,000 constituents in my district.
So 170,000. This month alone, we're looking at approximately 210,000 apprehensions on the southern border. Just this month. And that's just apprehensions. Compared to the population of your constituency, that's a huge number of people. So, as a New York City Council member, and I apologize for not being front end of your testimony, but have you heard some significant pushback using Floyd Bennett Field from your constituency?
Oh, yes, we are. And just to speak to the work authorization and the giving any other type of alternatives, we have done that. All city council members were asked to give alternatives, and alternatives were given. And I do have shelters within my district that we work well with. We are hearing from our constituents that we only have one police force on the Brooklyn side, the other is the 63rd precinct, on the Queens side is the 100th precinct. Each are down in numbers. We have no more than 4 cars in patrol of the entire command at any given time on the Queens side. They could never get over to Floyd Bennett Field and patrol that area as well. Fire department, if you look, we have the mayor put out his management report, and response times for both the NYPD and the FDNY are significantly higher. So now you're thinking about having FDNY then cover Floyd Bennett Field, which has fire hydrants that are not all operational, but are currently being checked.
So, Ms.
today.
Areola, just because I'm just about out of time, I'm just going to, from your comments, I'm going to make the assumption that your constituents agree that we have a problem
Yes,
on our southern border,
yes,
and they've probably lost their sense of humor on accommodating more migrants until we deal with that problem. Is that correct?
that is absolutely correct.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, once again, it was you that took the initiative on this, and I just can't emphasize strongly enough that I appreciate you being willing to do it. All of us need to eventually come together to solve this thing, but I appreciate your leadership in taking the right step in natural resources. I yield back.
Gentlemen, as time's expired, I know there's been a lot of talk about funding of the Park Service, and since fiscal year 13, the National Park Service budget has increased by 26%, the largest percentage of which was in 2018 under the Trump administration. And I will also note and enter into the record, the Biden administration requested a decrease in fiscal year 24 in their budget request, a 19.9% cut, which is $1.23 billion. And as my colleagues have mentioned, the interior markup only cuts it $500 million. So without objection, I'll enter that into the record. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome all of our witnesses who are here today, and especially those of you who traveled to be here. And I really do genuinely welcome the opportunity to hear from our communities, to hear from our local officials, but I do have to note that it is very odd to be having what appears to be a New York City county and city council meeting in the chambers of the House Natural Resources Committee. I think it's notable as well that all of the members who sit on this committee from New York did not ask for this hearing and actually support the city and the state's requests to use this space. And I do want to clarify, because there's been some misinformation propagated on the other side of the aisle this morning, that it was in fact the city of New York that requested this lease. It was not the federal government. So I understand we have a federal oversight role here, but it was the city of New York and the state of New York that have asked to use this emergency space, which, by the way, has been used previously as emergency shelter and for other emergency purposes, including during Superstorm Sandy. So I think it's very disingenuous for folks this morning to be representing this as somehow something other than it is. There's also been a lot of misrepresentation of the mayor of New York's statements and a sense put forward, including this ridiculous sign back here, that the mayor made these comments with respect to the use of this emergency site, and that's just factually untrue. But I think we all know here that this is not what this hearing is about. It's being held the week that our colleagues, unfortunately, across the aisle have been unable to pass a federal budget, and in 4 days will shut our government down. And this really is a publicity stunt. I mean, look at the posters in the room. When I walked in here this morning, the staff were putting up these posters. This is not about the people of New York. I have great respect for the people of Brooklyn and the people of New York. This is a humanitarian crisis. This is a serious immigration issue. We do have a humanitarian crisis happening right now. There are thousands of people coming to the United States right now. I represent a border state. I represent the people of New Mexico. And we know that we have to search for real solutions. But if this was an actual federal oversight hearing on immigration solutions, we'd be in a different committee, for one. And two, we'd be talking about actual policies that would solve the problem. But that's not what we're talking about here. In fact, the budget that's going to be brought to the floor in the coming days would slash the very programs that help address asylum. I mean, it's ridiculous. It truly is ridiculous. And it's not even a real budget. It's not even going to pass. They're bringing a budget to the floor that's not going to pass, and then they're going to shut the government down. I mean, it's truly outrageous. It really boggles the mind. And so I do want to say to my colleagues, if you want to work on immigration reform, let's work on immigration reform. We need bipartisan immigration reform. We need a pathway to citizenship. We need an asylum system that works. We need border security that is humane and appropriate. We need to address this crisis. We need you to act. But you got to keep the government open first. And we need you to come to the table and actually work on bipartisan immigration reform. Stop blocking it. Stop bringing false solutions forward. And stop using the people of New York for a publicity stunt. And stop demonizing the people who are coming to this country to seek asylum. New York has always been a place of immigrants. Every single country in the world has a community in the city of New York. It is the most international city. My own family came through New York City in the 1850s to escape famine in Ireland, like many of your families did. So if you want to be serious about immigration reform, you want to be serious about the people of New York, you want to be serious about helping people across the world who are struggling with violence, with famine, and economic desperation, then come to the table and be serious. But don't use this committee as a political stunt. Don't use this committee to dehumanize people coming to this country. And don't use this committee as a farce to try to make the people of New York think that you actually care about them, because that's not what this is about. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning, and with that, I yield back.
The young lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin. Mr. Tiffany, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spencer, did I hear correctly that you're going to have 2 officers for that entire encampment if you're not authorized to have more people?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We actually only have 2 officers currently on duty at any given time there. So it's not for the encampment. That's for our day-to-day operations.
So if there's an encampment and if there's not, you're not provided more security, you're going to have 2 officers?
Correct.
Ms. Williams, I think I heard you say that what is going on is not humane and not ethical. Did I hear you correct in your testimony?
Yes, you did.
Ms. Areola, did I hear you say you want the lease revoked?
I think that the lease should never have been signed, never should have been offered, never should have been asked for. It is a national federal park, yes.
So should this committee, which has jurisdiction, if we can do this, should we revoke that, that lease?
I believe you should.
Mr. Chairman, I think this committee should take a look at the possibility of doing this because it's clearly not in the interests of New Yorkers. Ms. Acer, do you support the Floyd Bennett lease?
Yes, Congressmember. Actually, I explained earlier that I am not an expert on national parks or the legal system overseeing it, so I'm going to restrict my comments to the areas of my expertise.
Did the minority tell you about what you were going to be testifying in regards to here today? Because it is about the Floyd Bennett lease.
Yeah, I was asked to come to speak about real solutions to addressing the challenges that we face at the border and in our major cities as we receive people seeking asylum and migrants.
So, Mr. Chairman, really interesting. They do not send anyone, the administration doesn't send anyone to testify at this hearing. And then it's almost like there's a bait and switch that went on here with Ms. Acer. She knows what she wants to testify on, but it's not on the subject that's before us in regards to the Floyd Bennett lease. Before I comment on that, Ms. Acer, you said in your written testimony you had that we need to do what's humane and morally right. Do you think what's going on with fentanyl across our country is humane and morally right?
Thank you very much, Congressmember. I think that it's probably at this point pretty well known from all the fact-checking that fentanyl, which is absolutely disastrous, comes primarily in through ports of entry.
Yeah, so I would just correct you on that. That is incorrect. And I would urge you to go meet with someone who testified under oath before the Judiciary Committee, Sheriff Mark Daniels from Cochise County, who's south of Tucson on the Mexico border, who has testified under oath that it is a direct result of January 20th of 2021, when President Biden adopted open borders policies, that the fentanyl that was coming into America skyrocketed. And I don't think it's humane or morally right to see the #1 killer of young people in America at this point being fentanyl poisonings, not overdoses, poisonings. I don't think that's right. Ms. Acer, do you think there's other national parks that, if need be, we continue on the pace that we're at with millions of people coming into America, that we should turn any other national parks into encampments?
Thank you very much, Congressmember. Again, I'm not an expert on national parks, but I do think
Would
that
you
there are
support,
key steps.
I've got a real brief amount of time. Do you support additional national parks? Would you support I have the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore in my district. If we continue to burst at the seams, should we turn that into illegal immigration encampment?
So I love to use national parks too and fully support national parks.
I'm going to
but
close. You're not answering my question. It would be a really easy yes or no. Should we use the national parks for this? I'm going to close, Mr. Chairman, by just saying, America, if you don't know yet, there's a party that refuses to acknowledge what happened. January 20th of 2021, open borders were declared in America, and this is what we've got. And we hear from the other side, you are not talking about solutions. We gave you a solution. We vetted it. We marked it up in the Judiciary Committee. It's H.R. 2. It secures the border. You can vote for it any time. We gave you a solution. First, we secure the borders, and we could do that in a minute if we want to. Republicans are defending your national parks at this point, ladies and gentlemen. The other side wants to turn them into homeless encampments. And the ranking member here admitted today that the Biden administration has failed. I think that's all we need to know. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Kamlager-Dove, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it has been a while for me since I've been held hostage in this circus, but here I am again, and I want to welcome you to the circus. I did not know in the Natural Resources Committee that we would be talking about New York instead of the Republican government shutdown that is upon us in just a matter of days. Instead of talking about the fact that the House Republicans' Interior Appropriations Bill cuts National Park Service funding by nearly $500 million, in addition to the fact that the recent CR includes more than $2 billion for Trump's border wall, which has destroyed public lands and tribal cultural resources irreparably. With no money for you, we are talking about New York City. This is an all-over-the-place hearing. It crosses all kinds of jurisdictional lines. We've been talking about addiction and substance abuse, asylum seekers, migrants, refugees, foreign policy, New York, laments from the local law enforcement, housing, and yes, a whiplash stance on NEPA, and not anything that we would normally be talking about in this committee. Last month, we heard from Republican witnesses who were here to talk about mining extraction, saying to us, the NEPA rules are just too long. It's too hard to read, too many words on the pages. Why should we follow them? And now here we are hearing manufactured umbrage about cities not following NEPA. NEPA that the Republicans gutted. Disingenuous is the kindest word I can use right now about what I am feeling and hearing in this committee. And Mr. Spencer, you are incorrect. It is all about politics today. In your testimony, you talked about wanting a bipartisan coalition to revisit H.R. 3924. This Congress can't even get it together to keep the government open. You only have 2 staff people. You want more. Don't look to the Republicans. They're trying to shut it all down. You won't get a dime. So let's not kid ourselves. I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I wish we would be talking about some of these issues. Instead, we're talking about China and Russia, countries that the last president was like kissing folks' behinds like nobody's business. Is the issue an immigration policy that we don't have? Absolutely. Republicans don't have one. Oh, except hiding barbed wire in the river to maim and kill pregnant women migrants. So give me a break. Migrants aren't voluntarily flooding into cities. Republican governors are flooding our cities with migrants, using people as pawns. Propaganda. This is a game, and we're talking about people's lives. And by the way, it is not President Biden's fault. He's trying to fix manure dropped by the former president, who had a reckless, feckless, racist, xenophobic, non-foreign policy foreign policy. So please don't give me that. And Mr. Spencer, I'm so sorry that you don't have the staffing that you need. You should talk to your mayor and your city council, but not to us. You probably don't have it because of challenges with COVID, early retirement, injuries, a strong economy, and lawsuit settlements that your city is facing. Not what happens under the normal jurisdiction of this committee. Talk to the mayor, talk to the city council, talk to the governor, talk to the state assembly, talk to the state senate. I'm here to talk about what happens in this committee and the fact that the Republicans can't even get it together to pass rules to talk about their own bills so that we can prevent a government shutdown. And I just heard a colleague from the other side of the aisle bring me into a white people only brigade. Non-English speaking people don't deserve to get any support? I will end with this. In these late nights, getting on an elevator to go down to the House, there was a worker who comes here at night to clean our offices, and he doesn't speak very good English. And do you know what he said as the doors were closing? Because he's here at night cleaning all of our offices, Republicans and Democrats alike. He said, will there be any money? Because he needs his paycheck. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't seem to care about
The
that.
gentlelady's time has
I yield
expired.
the rest of my time. Thank
Gentlelady's
you,
time
Mr.
has
Chair.
expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just note, I think Mr. Spencer.
Mr. Lawler, I thought we
Waved
you in early. Ask unanimous consent that we allow Mr. Lawler to join the dais without objection. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just noted, it looks like Mr. Spencer works for the U.S. Park Police, so I don't know what mayor or city council he should be talking to. I think he should be speaking to Congress. But look, we have a crisis in New York, and it is a crisis of the making of the elected officials in New York City and New York State. Our southern border has been wide open for years. Since Joe Biden took office, nearly 6 million migrants have crossed the border, many illegally. The asylum cases are taking 2 to 3 years to be heard, at minimum. When these cases are finally heard, nearly 2/3 are being rejected. And yet New York City's response is to enact sanctuary city policies, refuse to cooperate with ICE, right to shelter policies, and using taxpayer funds to provide free housing, free healthcare, free education, free food, free clothing, and then be shocked that people would want to come to New York. Now, my family came through Ellis Island over 100 years ago. New York is a beacon. And I believe in immigration. My wife is an immigrant. She came to this country in search of a better life and economic opportunity and education. I'm proud of the fact that she became a United States citizen 2.5 years ago. We have a 17-month-old daughter who will have a better life because her mother chose to come to the United States of America. There is a reason people want to come here, and we accept that. We embrace that. We are a nation of immigrants, but there must be a process. You cannot continue to have tens of thousands of migrants cross the southern border every week and be shocked that municipalities can't handle it. Having sanctuary city policies has been one of the dumbest things I've ever seen for years. And only now are Democrats in New York finally waking up and going, "Ooh, this is a problem." You think? Eric Adams and Kathy Hochul don't have the first clue how to handle this. Because to handle it would be to acknowledge that these policies have failed, would be to acknowledge that these policies don't work. Yes, we need to reform our immigration system. Yes, we need to deal with the, at minimum, 11.5 million who are here undocumented. Yes, we need to have a more merit-based system that deals with our employment shortages, doctors, nurses, engineers, home health aides. We need immigrants in this country. They contribute to our economy. They contribute to our communities. They're good people. But there needs to be a process. And to allow this to continue in perpetuity, as my Democrat colleagues have for years, and immediately, the moment you raise a question, oh, it's racist, it's xenophobic. Total nonsense. Total nonsense. We're not only dealing with a humanitarian crisis at the border, we're dealing with human trafficking, women and children being raped, assaulted, sold, fentanyl pouring into our country, killing 70,000 Americans a year. And Joe Biden has done absolutely nothing. This is totally unsustainable. Eric Adams said that if this continues, it will destroy New York City. They are talking about $12 billion over 3 years, $12 billion in taxpayer money to deal with this crisis. The time for action is now. Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, both from New York, both from Brooklyn, silent, pathetic. Grow a backbone, show some leadership, stand up and say, we're not going to have a system like this anymore. Secure the border. We need more border personnel. We need more court personnel to hear these asylum cases immediately. Remain in Mexico should be the policy of the United States, period. Then deal with the undocumented. Deal with DACA. And fix the legal immigration system so that those people who want to come to the United States to participate in our economy, to have a better life for themselves and their children can do so, but do so legally. That is all that needs to be done. This is not rocket science. And all of my colleagues in New York City and New York State need to wake up and speak out and speak very clearly. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman. You know, I was excited to come over here because This hearing is supposed to be about national parks, and I could not wait to have a conversation with my colleagues who are apparently so concerned about the state of our national parks. Perhaps because they are so concerned, they will reconsider the budget bill that they are trying to move that would cut $436 million from the National Park Service, a 13% cut from last year. Because they care so deeply about national parks, perhaps they will rethink their stance on H.R. 21, a bill that would enable more than $400 million of public land to be given to the oil and gas companies for drilling. When we were debating that, the ranking member, Mr. Grijalva, put in an amendment that would prevent any new drilling in national parks. My Republican colleagues voted that amendment down. Perhaps now they will reconsider. Perhaps they will reconsider their support of President Trump's failed plan to remove 35 million acres from federal protection, the only president in history to have removed more federal land from protection than he added. And maybe they will rethink the language that they put into the House rules this year to value all federal land at $0, the sole purpose of which is to make it easier to discharge protected lands from federal protection. So slashing funding from public parks and the National Park Service, opening up protected land to oil and gas drilling, privatization, this is not how you protect national parks, which I am glad to hear my colleagues care so deeply about. I hope that they will work with us in a bipartisan way on real policies to strengthen and support our national parks program. And I hope that they will show even a little bit of concern for the people who are unhoused in New York City. To be clear, these are human beings, many of whom came to this country through a legal process, something that my colleagues often fail to acknowledge. In many cases, these are migrants fleeing cartel violence, human trafficking, persecution from their governments. And they, in many cases, came to legal points of entry at the border to apply for legal asylum through a legal process under our laws, and are now waiting for their cases to be heard, unhoused in New York and other places. So let's be clear about what we're talking about here. We are talking about, in New York City, one former airport. It still has runways being used for temporary housing for people who, in many cases, are using a legal process to attempt to immigrate to our country. We're not talking about Yellowstone. We're not talking about the Rocky Mountains National. We're not talking about iconic national parks. Although, unfortunately, if members of the public are interested in visiting those parks, they are not going to be able to do so next week because of the Republican government shutdown that is looming. All we're talking about, though, when it comes to temporarily housing migrants, is an airport in Brooklyn. Come on. Let's get serious here about real immigration reform that improves security, that provides legal avenues for an orderly system. And let's talk about real policies to protect our national parks from budget cuts, from drilling. Let's protect our national parks. That is what the work of this committee is supposed to be about. So with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this very important hearing today. You know, under this administration, every community has now become a border community. The failed policies of this administration have forced Americans to suffer the disastrous consequences, no matter how far they live from our borders. It's shameful to see this has extended as far as our national parks and other lands. I proudly served my community as a member of the Duluth, Minnesota Police Department for over 2 decades, 23 years. I am very concerned that the Biden administration's migrant crisis has impacted the safety of our law enforcement and our communities. Since the spring of 2022, over 100,000 migrants have arrived in New York City. And over that same time, the city manager describes in the average response time for crimes in progress when people call the police, they're delayed, and sometimes it's violent crimes that are delayed. Councilwoman Areola, with the New York PD clearly overburdened with the increase in crime across your city, are you concerned that the growing migrant crisis will further overextend resources for the NYPD?
Absolutely.
Are you concerned about response times for people that are calling for help?
Yes.
And so what effect will this have on the safety of your constituents?
It will absolutely adversely affect the safety of our constituents and any migrants that would be placed on Floyd Bennett Field.
You know, as a victim of a violent shooting myself, I remember getting on the radio and calling for help. And help arrived within 30 seconds because I was in the downtown area. In my mind, when I was interviewed, I thought it was several minutes. When you need help by law enforcement in critical times, you need it now, not 3 or 4 minutes. And I'm sad that your constituents have to go through this because of this disastrous border policy. What are you hearing from your constituents regarding the increase in response time for those crimes in progress, for those small businesses, for those people that are walking and being assaulted and robbed on the street?
Absent the migrant crisis, we're hearing great concern from our constituents for those very reasons. We're always asking for more police to be placed at our precincts, more patrols on our streets, more beat cops on our residential and our commercial strips, and it's just not able to be done
How is
because
the
we don't
morale?
have the manpower.
How is the
morale is extremely low.
Mr. Spencer, I imagine that hosting a camp for 2,000 migrants at Floyd Bennett Field in temporary housing will make it much more difficult for the Park Police and NYPD to do the job. Can you explain the additional law enforcement challenges that will come with the migrant camp at Floyd Bennett Field?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, basically, right now, we're already struggling day to day to meet our mission requirements with what we do.
Speaking of that, tell us your day-to-day duties as a U.S. Park Police officer. And does migrant and refugee population management fall into the regular duties of U.S. Park Police officers?
Not directly, sir, but anything that falls on our jurisdiction in the national parks and public lands that we patrol will definitely be our responsibility. But our concern is our staffing level right now. Over the last year, we had 511 officers sworn total since last June. Over that time, today, we've hired 68 officers. We've only yielded 15 total because of our attrition and our retention problem. So to that end, to answer your question, we have, like I said before, 2 officers usually patrolling that area. To add 2,000 migrants in a camp is going to definitely strain our operations.
Do you think non-migrants who wish to visit Floyd Bennett Field, do you think that that number will be diminished once the migrant population enters?
I really don't know if that'll happen or not, sir. I do know that there is a youth sports complex nearby. I do know that there's a child petting zoo and some other it's a playground. I know they do hay rides for children in that area. We are concerned about that.
Finally, if the Biden administration secures our open southern border to reduce the number of migrants flooding communities across the country, including New York City, at a record pace, will it help alleviate some of the law enforcement issues facing the NYPD and Park Police?
I would agree that the homeless problem in general, if it was reduced in our parks, would definitely help out the law enforcement situation.
Real quick, we also have a northern border. Last year, we had an incident up north where 5 migrants came over. We don't know where they are. They came across a northern lake, and the reason we weren't able to apprehend them because our Customs and Border Patrol agents were ordered to in their offices, the illegals coming across the southern border, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espillat. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Chairman, words matter. Words could be used to bring about solutions to complicated problems, or words could be used to throw gasoline on fire, to promote hate, violence, and havoc. So it's important that we distinguish rhetoric that's used for that purpose from facts. So let me give you some of the facts. Fact, according to the conservative-leaning Cato Institute, 99% of fentanyl in the U.S. is smuggled into the United States by some of our own citizens. That's the Cato Institute saying it, not me, not you. An entity that you often rely on for facts. Fact, although there has been a very low unemployment rate, perhaps the lowest in 60 years, 90,000 New Yorkers have left the labor force since the pandemic began. Fact, the 60,000 migrants that have stayed in New York City, out of those 60,000, 20,000 are children. And out of the remaining ones, of the remaining 40,000, 15,000 are Venezuelans that have already benefited from extended TPS and are able to work. So what we have is 25,000 people. And by the way, the children, they bring in federal dollars through schools, through Title I, which you must understand what it is, and Title III, although as we speak right now, the other side of the aisle is trying to gut Title I by 80%. Fact, a total of 25,000 of the migrants left are the ones that we're dealing with. Fact, in 1907, over 1.25 million people came through New York City through Ellis Island, exactly when the city had a smaller infrastructure and a much smaller safety net. Almost 1.3 million people immigrants came through Ellis Island in 1907, right through New York City, and yet we were able to handle that. So these are the facts. The last fact that I want to point out that is back in 1986, that a very prominent leader from your party passed amnesty. His name was Ronald Reagan. Not President Carter, not President Kennedy, not President Obama, Ronald Reagan. So those are the facts. So let's not engage in rhetoric that's volatile, that will lead to violence, that will pin us against each other. I want to ask a question to the two representatives from New York at the state and local level, because this is personal to me. I came to the United States back in 1964 with my family on a visitor's visa. Overstayed my visa, had to get my green card later on, but I was here with no papers. What would you have done with me as a 9-year-old? Would you have sent me to Rikers Island? Would you have sent me under a bridge? Where would you have placed me and my family back in the 1960s if that was the case today? I'm a member of Congress right now. Obviously, I haven't seen any bloody incident from the migrants. 100,000 of them, and you can't point out one really reprehensible act of violence. And you're saying that they're taxing the police department? You grab out 100,000 people anywhere, and you're going to have dozens of felonies per heart. Anywhere on Park Avenue, anywhere in the city of New York. So what will you have, my question, what would you have done with me and my family back in 1964 when I came in without any papers? And now I'm a member of Congress right here, walking the halls of Congress with all of these folks here, having the same vote that they have and having an impact on the future of this nation. You're a city councilwoman, you're an assemblywoman. I served 14 years in the New York State Assembly. What would you have done with me back in 1964?
I would have protected you just like I want to protect all the immigrants that came in as
Thank you.
families prior to
Thank you.
this influx of migrants who are
Thank
now
you.
skipping the line while people like you were still waiting. People like your family who went through the proper process, got the green card now, and you applied for citizenship and you got citizenship. And it may
way
have
to
taken you
protect
years.
them-
However,
The way
now
to
they're
protect them is to
skipping
give
the
them a
line.
safe environment where they can be safe with their families. Women that have walked thousands of miles to get to the border, believe me, they will never be late to work. They won't miss a day's work because they got the sniffle. You walk 2,000 miles with 3 of your kids, you're going to be a force for our economy. We should give you the opportunity to bring us back. Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Congressman.
The gentleman's time has expired. If
Thank
you
you,
could
Mr.
just
Chair.
briefly answer, Assemblywoman.
Thank you for sharing. I too am an immigrant. I must state this here. But going back to what you just stated, I am certainly would not put any family in an area that's isolated, no transit whatsoever, and have them in a flood zone for further implications down the road.
Where will
Because
you
your
put them?
family will matter.
But where will you put them?
Where will I put them? This will be a conversation that we have to have with
Where
all
will you
parts
put
of
them right
government.
now, today?
Well, if
You don't
they're,
have an answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
that's your opinion.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bench. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. The politically sensitive nature of this issue, of course, has been well discussed. And I'm curious, I want to make it clear, but I'm curious from the folks from New York, the two counselors, if you are happy that we're having this hearing today, here at the congressional level, are you happy to be here today sharing with your constituents, of course, but the rest of America, the need to discuss this issue?
I'm absolutely happy to be here today to discuss this issue because it really is a federal issue. This migrant crisis that we're facing in New York City should never be taken care of by the locality. Department of Homeless Services is not prepared to give services to over 120,000 migrants. And when you take...
We have a lot to cover, Ms. Williams. I'm going to come back to you, so Ms.
Okay.
Williams, Councilor Williams, your thoughts? You're happy to be here today?
Absolutely happy, but I must say for the record, I am very highly insulted that they would look at Floyd Bennett Field, our national park, that we treasure in the southeast side of Brooklyn, and deem it not as good as Yellowstone. This is an insult on our community, and using this platform on our natural resources to counteract with each other is insulting.
You are happy to be here today, be able to
Yes,
share
I
your
am.
thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
If New York, it's one of the most wealthy communities, cities, metropolises in our country, is this challenged to find places to put these folks, what does that mean about the rest of the cities across the United States? What are they doing with the thousands upon thousands of people that are coming in each day? I don't want to ask you to hazard a guess, but this is not just New York's problem that we're facing, but it most assuredly is one that belongs before this committee. And I must say I resent my colleagues from across the aisle suggesting that we manufactured this hearing today, that it's somehow fabricated and phony, some sort of an opportunity to talk about one of the greatest problems that our nation now faces. And one of the things we say back home is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. And that means you gotta address the flow of thousands, millions of people across the border first. What we heard today, not one person, I don't think, on the other side of the aisle talked about the need to address border security first. Not one. A lot of talk about how we need a comprehensive system, a lot of talk about how unfeeling we Republicans are, but the truth of the matter is, we have to address the border first, because otherwise, what do we have to build upon when it comes to creating a comprehensive system? And you folks in New York City are one of the best bully pulpits to talk about the challenge that your communities face. So you, at this point, someone in the community has decided that the national park is the place to go, and thus it brings us in this committee to talk about it. And you've been asked repeatedly, is there some other thing to do? If the answer is no, I agree. That's what all the little communities are saying. The answer is no. We are out of space to put these thousands, these millions of people. Yet we did not hear that from the folks from the other side of the aisle. It amazes me because what we need to do is get control of the border. Now, either of you can talk about, please, Ms. Areola, do I have it right? Do we need to control the border first so we can talk about comprehensive solutions second?
Absolutely.
And how would you, would you be supportive of us focusing on ways of addressing asylum? Because as we all know, about 1 out of 10 persons granted asylum are entitled to it, 1 out of 10, and the other 9 disappear. And so the point of the matter is we are allowing in 90% more people than we should under the guise of asylum. We need to address it, yet we did not hear a peep about that. Instead, mere attacks upon Republicans for having the audacity to suggest that we should stop people at the border. But there's no other solution when there's no place for them to go, even in a place as wealthy as New York City. That's why I'm happy for this hearing today. Ms. Williams, you were cut off a number of times. I have 29. You have 28 seconds. Add what you want to say.
Well, I just want to say that's the whole thing. Asking all these questions and then wanting to get just a yes or no answer. I don't have.
Mike.
Sorry, I don't have a solution as to where to put them, but I'm very sure if we had the conversation from the bottom up or the top come down, including the state, the city, and the federal, we may get to some other solution. So when you don't give me an opportunity to answer correctly and you then walk off, then it really tells me that, you're not really here based on the issue, again, of using our national park, which deemed as it's just an old airport runway. That's insulting to me and to the people that I represent in the southeast side of Brooklyn.
Thank you for your testimony. Yield back.
Gentlemen, as time's expired, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. I've been following this from my office. We're 4 days, just 4 days away from a government shutdown. The question on America's minds is, will Congress pass legislation so that we can continue paying our federal employees and all those who rely on them, from the Head Start classes in my district to the Head Start classes in New York? But that's not why we are called here today. Instead, we're having a hearing with lots of posters to talk about an issue that, once again, is on Congress's plate, because we have refused to address and pass immigration reform to fix a broken system. Ms. Acer, thank you. Thank you for your recommendations to better serve the migrants seeking asylum, which is presently the law of the land. Is that correct?
Yes, U.S. law allows people at ports of entry or within the United States to seek asylum.
So we have a law that needs to be addressed, and we have an issue, an immigrant issue that needs to be addressed. But let's talk about what's really happening. How would a government shutdown impact the ability of federal, state, local agencies, and nonprofits to provide shelter and humanitarian aid to these migrants? Take us out a bit and say, what would a shutdown do to the ability of these wonderful humanitarians, people who want to serve those who need shelter because they remember that proverb?
A shutdown could affect humanitarian organizations in quite a few ways. And the Biden administration really should take steps to minimize that. The last thing we want to see are humanitarian organizations, faith-based groups, and others who are working on the front lines not be reimbursed or reimbursed promptly for the very important critical assistance they're providing, which is essential to U.S. communities, and it's also essential, by the way, to Customs and Border Protection.
Thank you so very much, because if we do not actually provide the Biden administration with the funds, because we shut the federal government down, those agencies, and that's going to be across our country, is that correct? It's not just in New York, it's across our country where we're going to see this harm, this hurt.
There's risks across the country, and in addition, I just want to emphasize again the devastating impact this will have on the ability to actually resolve asylum claims by adding immeasurably to the immigration court backlog and delaying those cases for years. People we represent, refugees seeking asylum in this country, are waiting years to get their cases resolved. There's so much Congress can do to really make sure that the immigration courts are funded properly so the cases move much more quickly and fairly. Thank you.
So when we have a budget that is proposed that would cut significantly from these cases, what we are actually doing is making this problem worse rather than solving it so that we could then have some political theater around it. I want to move a bit to Mr. Spencer. In a recent letter, Secretary Harlan, a letter written by my Republican colleagues, they noted, and this is beautiful language, and I completely agree with the Republicans on that, that national parks are important for Americans, I quote, to experience wonder, to recreate and find joy, or to simply learn more about the great history of our nation, close quote. I am very concerned because with the impending shutdown, but not just the impending shutdown, but with the proposed cuts in appropriations, Republicans are stealing Americans' joy. Republicans are going to be stealing Americans' joy in our parks. But Mr. Spencer, there's a proposed cut in the appropriations of $500 million to the National Park Service. That's going to absolutely cut park officers and rangers with a $500 million cut that would impact the number of rangers and police officers. What would that do to morale and your ability to actually protect those places of awe?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. As far as we see it from my level, from the members on the boots on the ground with the U.S. Park Police, we've been dealing with this for decades. So our funding has been cut across both sides of the aisle. I don't know where the money's going, but it certainly doesn't make it down to the U.S. Park Police through the National Park Service. So that's the best I can answer for that. I mean, we've had cuts across the board. We don't have the money to hire any more officers this next fiscal year. And that was a direct conversation I had with our chief of police.
So we actually need more funding to make sure we can adequately protect the parks and the people who attend them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, my time is up, and I yield back. Thank you so very much.
Ladies, time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maliotakis. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for coming to see Floyd Bennett Field, unlike our colleague from Rhode Island that wants to disparage our park in New York City, which is, as you said, Ms. Williams, very insulting that you would say it's okay to have a migrant encampment in the middle of Brooklyn because he feels the park is not as nice as some of the other national parks in the country. We invite him to come visit as well so he could learn something. I would like to first start by saying it's disappointing that the Department of Interior and the National Park Service refused to come here to answer questions. I wonder why they refused to come here. Maybe it's because they did something wrong, and I think we're going to get to the bottom of that. And I thank the chairman for doing this. I want to start by saying, in response to my colleague from New York, who said that everything is great in New York, there's no problems, and unlike the mayor is saying that it is destroying New York. And he said, well, has anyone gotten injured? Well, you know what? They were on a tour at Roosevelt Hotel, that shelter, right? Remember that? It got a lot of media coverage. Right after they left that tour, someone got stabbed in that hotel. It was migrant, stabbed another migrant, and that is, there was dozens of arrests that have taken place at that hotel already for assault. In Staten Island, we saw unlicensed drivers without plates slamming into vehicles, totaling people's cars in the community. In Brooklyn, there was a DUI, a bust that led to, of a migrant that led to a sergeant, an NYPD sergeant's finger being bitten off. We've seen multiple crimes. One Venezuelan migrant, actually 14 crimes in 2 months. That's pretty much a record for New York. And in 2 upstate New York shelters, there were individuals arrested for rape, forcing that county, by the way, to say they're not going to accept any migrants, and forcing our governor to say that they should go somewhere else. So, Mr. Spencer, my question on public safety is to you first, being that you represent the U.S. Park Police. Is your agency concerned about public safety?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Before I answer it, thank you for your continued support with the U.S. Park Police, FOP. Is our agency concerned with the migrant situation that is proposed for Floyd Bennett Field? Yes, they are. And again, that's because of our staffing levels right now. That is in our resources. We don't have the staffing or the resources to handle 2,000 migrants put into a tent on our property right now.
You feel it's a bad idea for this encampment to be placed at Floyd Bennett?
It's certainly going to make our law enforcement duties much more difficult.
Okay, Councilwoman Areola, in your testimony, and also Assemblywoman Williams, which I'm happy you're both here, because it's a bipartisan effort here that you want to stop this from happening in your community. So I applaud this. It's not Republican versus Democrat. It is 2 people coming together for the betterment of their community. And so what I want to say is SEQA is a State Environmental Quality Review Act. We also have the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. Those were violated, right? They did not do anything to address any of environmental impact. It's so interesting because some of my colleagues from New York City want to shut everything down because we don't follow NEPA. Now all of a sudden want to see NEPA being completely bypassed. They have no regard for the environment all of a sudden. Can you comment on that?
I think it's very insulting to not follow NEPA regulations, to not even have a public hearing for community input. And this is why our citizens are forced to voice their concerns for their safety and our environment, and for everyone that utilized Floyd Bennett Field. I will remind you, it is a national park. Whether you want to compare it to Yellowstone or a plain old airport field, I ask you, come, I'll take you around, and you'll see the phenomenal things that happen at Floyd Bennett Field, our national park.
Thank you. And Councilwoman Areola, would you like to add to not following any of the laws?
Right. We recently asked for for MPS to extend a soccer field at Tilden, Fort Tilden, which is on my side of the Queens District. And we were flatly denied access, and I believe that you do have an email from the MPS stating why, because it would not conform with what is regularly at that location, and that it could impede other activities, it could impede protected property, protected species, and all of that. All of this has been negated at Floyd Bennett Field. No NEPA, no CEQA, no EIS, and an expedited EA without any community outreach.
Thank you, and because I run out of time, I just want to make a point to say, Chairman, I appreciate you looking into the fact that no environmental impact statement, no environmental assessment, they claim it's an emergency, but yet the President says nothing's going on at the border, there's no emergency to see here, so how do they get away with this? And that is what the committee has to be tasked to look into. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Ladies, time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What committee are you in, Mr. Chairman?
The House Natural Resources Committee,
Okay,
Mr. LaMalfa.
and what, does it have jurisdiction over the national park system?
Has jurisdiction over all of the Department of Interior and national parks.
So today's hearing about the national parks, in this case in New York, is an appropriate venue for the conversation, yes?
We have a duty to have oversight over the National Park Service.
Okay, and there's 435 members of the House with many, many committees meeting, some of them working on fiscal issues such as funding the government today?
That's
Probably,
correct.
likely. So it is possible to walk and chew gum at the same time on many issues in the U.S. Congress. All right, good. Well, then we're in an appropriate place to talk about these issues of the parks in New York and the overwhelming effect this is going to have upon them, and we sympathize and we thank those folks here today for traveling and being with us on this. I'll just dive into a couple questions here for Assemblywoman Williams and Councilmember Areola. You may be aware of the New York Restoration Project, as it's called. I've been made aware of it, so I'm certain you are. Of course, it maintains community gardens and parks in the city. And in 2019, the project has published a study which observed that the increase in park and general green space in the East Harlem neighborhood of New York resulted in over 200 fewer felonies committed per year, a reduction of over 50%. So with the lease signed by the Department of Interior, a substantial amount of recreational space will be taken away. So can you speak to the fact that housing these illegal immigrants on Floyd Bennett Field will have on the local area in the loss of recreation and increased crime possibilities, not only from the neighborhood having less park, when we've seen the crime of the neighborhood itself go down, but the crime that will be generated from these camps?
Yes, thank you. So we have a number of groups that go to Floyd Bennett Field regularly. We have the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Park Conservancy, which was made to postpone their Public Arts Festival. They also have a new project that we've all been working with an EIS, with the community, and for outreach for the betterment of Floyd Bennett Field. There are bird clubs, there are people who fish there, there are people who kayak there, there are people who have archery there, there is Aviator Sports Center.
I'm sorry, but please focus on the crime aspect of what you would expect.
So if you have two police officers from MPS on any given tour, and a depleted police force from the 6th and the 100th precinct who would have oversight there, then absolutely it would be a crime issue.
Because of the camp itself, as well as now less park space that has been instrumental in lowering crime in the neighborhood, as statistically shown, right?
Right, and because there would be upwards of 2,000 to 7,500 people living on that park space.
Yeah.
And that really is a community. That's a community that deserves its own precinct, school board, and fire department. They wouldn't have that.
Thank you very much. As we've stated, Floyd Bennett Field is unsafe for anyone to be living there. You talk about crime, you just heard from Mr. Spencer. Oh my goodness, did it again. So again, we're saying that Floyd Bennett Field is unsafe and unsuitable for anyone to live. You talk about the crime. I think Mr. Spencer shared that the burden that this will have on his force, having just 2 officers there. We're looking at 2,000 plus single migrant men. I don't have, I can't tell the future. I don't have a crystal ball in front of me to say what crime is going to be committed from what is not going to be committed,
Sure.
but we
Okay.
have to be prepared. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate that. Mr. Spencer, would you weigh in on that, please? Because what I'm wondering too is that has the Interior, Department of Justice, Homeland Security, have they offered any kind of help to pay for the employees that it's going to take to do this job, if indeed you could get more than 2?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. No, from everything I know, we have not been given any funding to supplement outside of normal operations on Floyd Bennett Field.
As the Park Police, what is the interface between them and New York Police Department for dealing with the crime that's expected?
I do know the NYPD is also severely understaffed, just as we are. They do work hand in hand with us on law enforcement functions, but primarily we are the servicing law enforcement agency for Floyd Bennett Field.
So it's a real recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It's going to overwhelm us.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's his time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Ranking Member Halva for holding the hearing today. President Biden's harmful border agenda has been felt by states far from the border nearly since the day he took office. Democrat leaders in sanctuary cities enacted President Biden's leftist immigration policies, and the crisis quickly spilled into rural states hundreds of miles away. If President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, and other administration officials were serious about controlling immigration and securing our border, we would not have this hearing today about New York State and the National Park Service. Our country's national parks are some of the greatest treasures. To allow illegal immigrants to set up camp in these parks and hamper everyday Americans' rights to visit and enjoy these parks is just another example of Biden and his cabinet putting their leftist agenda above the need of Americans. Just the other week, it was announced that over 100 migrants are going to be settled in Billings, Montana. What concerns me the most about this is that they are likely just the beginning of a process that will see many different states forced to accept these illegal immigrants and refugees. Where will the rest of the 100,000 Afghan refugees go? I can assure you, they will not be sent to sanctuary cities. Montana has many great and historic national parks. The last thing we need is the federal government coming in and telling us that the bedrock of our tourism and a significant factor in our economy will now be used against its intended purpose and instead for housing illegal immigrants. I hope that this committee can help shine some light on this issue and we can prevent the administration from trying similar tactics in states such as mine. Ms. Areola, how long is the Department of Interior proposing to house these illegal immigrants in or on Floyd Bennett Field?
The current lease is for 1 year, and then it has an option to extend for 2.
2 additional years, so a total of 3 or a total of 2?
No, for another year.
One
For an
and one.
additional year, right.
Okay. So the general public and the American taxpayers are only authorized to stay in Floyd Bennett Field for a maximum of 14 days, consecutive days. Yet Interior wants to violate their very own rules and basically grant an unlimited duration of stay to these illegal immigrants?
That would be correct.
You mentioned in your testimony that 1 million people a year enjoy Floyd Bennett Field. What kind of impact will housing these illegal immigrants have on the local economy, community safety, and the areas surrounding the national park?
What we've seen in the areas where there have been asylum seekers and illegal immigrants, we've seen crime tick up. We've seen what Representative Maliataka said. There have been violent crimes. There have been shoplifting has upticked. We have seen a lot of different crimes: rape, muggings, assaults, robberies, burglaries. These are all upticked since we have had this vast migration of illegal immigrants coming into our city.
Do you think that that type of activity is conducive to promoting tourism and economic development in your area?
You can't have tourism when all your hotels are full of migrants.
Mr. Spencer, I'd like to ask you a question. I don't have a law enforcement background. If you have 2,000 military-aged men that are contained in an area like that without tasks to be performed each day, so that they basically have a lot of idle hands, as my father used to call it, what is the likelihood for more criminal element to take place, crimes to take place?
I appreciate the question, Congressman. We are definitely concerned. The fact that premises is going to be put directly close to where there's going to be a lot of children is one of my primary concerns for the officers I represent. We really, like I said, we're already so short-staffed that it's going to be difficult to police 2,000 extra people. That takes away from our day-to-day operations. It's not even just the concerns that, putting 2,000 men on Floyd Bennett Field. It's also the concerns that we have for their safety as well, because if something happens to one of them, EMS typically in that area of New York City, they know how to get to Floyd Bennett Field, but if there's a specific area where one of these migrants are injured, they may not speak English, they could get hurt, one of our officers have to break away and escort them to that location just to make sure that they can be found. And so that leaves one officer available during that time.
Be very, very susceptible to having something tragic happen.
Correct, sir.
Lone officer. Very good. Thank you so much. Mr. Chair, I do see my time has expired. I would yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman or the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Kiggins. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to start by thanking our witnesses who took time to be with us today when we had other witnesses not show up. And it just, I think, says a lot about how much you care about this issue. So thank you very much for being here. It also says a lot about the people who did not show up to speak to this issue. You know, the numbers are staggering, and I don't think I need to repeat some of the headlines and words of my colleagues about human trafficking, drug trafficking, crime. The number of illegal immigrants crossing our border, 6 million. It's the size of the population of Denmark or Singapore. I mean, it's really, since Biden took office. So you think about that. And so I'm a person that likes to think of the problem and take 10 steps back. Well, how can we prevent this problem? And you all have presented so eloquently, you know, and been great advocates for your national park, but this is a problem in the park. So what can we do to prevent the problem? Well, I think step one, it would be great if we could just acknowledge that there is a problem at the border. There is a crisis at the border, and depending on who, but there's something that need to be done at the border. I went to the border twice. I represent Virginia's 2nd congressional district, so I'm not a border state, but we all are becoming border states. But just to see in real life and talk to those ranchers and talk to those homeowners and talk to the small business, talk to the Border Patrol, talk to law enforcement. I mean, the stories were shocking. And to listen how few of them there were, the amount of problems they deal with on a daily basis. I cannot understand why our current administration doesn't even acknowledge that there is a problem at the border. So that now we're talking about how it's bled into places on the East Coast, like Virginia, like New York, like Floyd Bennett Field, costing $12 billion over the next 3 years, 100,000 migrants coming to New York City since spring of 22. You talked about the 2,000 migrants and some of the security concerns, and I want to know what the infrastructure and kind of quality of life looks like. I can't imagine it's real good there. You know, it's like a tent city, I'm imagining. I haven't seen it, but what are these people doing? What are these children doing? What are the adults doing during the day? You know, what is the plan of action? Is there one? Or what are we doing with these people?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm sorry I don't follow your question. Are you asking about what the local community does there on a day-to-day basis?
What do the people there do?
Right, it's a recreational area, so there's nature trails, there's bird watching areas, there's beaches, and
The immigrants specifically, I'm sorry.
the immigrants specifically?
The immigrants that are
I mean, they're going to
housed
be
there.
part of that. They're going to be able to come and go as they please. There is going to be I don't exactly know what the facility is going to look like. From what I hear, it's going to be a tent, and that's the way it's described in the lease. But they are going to be able to come and go as they please. So they're going to be intermingling with the local community and being able to engage the park just like anyone else would.
So I can't imagine that everything is going to go super smoothly. And you talked about some of the crime issues and, again, security issues. So what will happen if there's an arrest or multiple arrests? Is there a place that we're going to house them, a place that we're going to hold arrested migrants over other arrested people in your city? Or what are the plans for that?
So that's part of what kind of baffled me with this lease agreement. As I stated before, we really weren't consulted on the operational plan as far as the law enforcement aspect of it goes. And from every time we have a special event or some type of incident outside of normal day-to-day operations, our agency comes up with an operational plan, an ops plan, to make sure that that special event or First Amendment activity, whatever it may be, is handled appropriately. Usually that makes, canceling days off for the officers that are on their day off to bring in extra officers to handle that kind of event. There has been no plan in place on what we're going to do with this.
It's frustrating to hear you speak about your recruitment retention and the quality of work that your officers. So please thank them for us. I know they're doing heavy lifts right now. Is the National Park Service or anyone else addressing any of the infrastructure problems to prepare for the migrant shelters at Floyd Bennett Field that we know of?
I'm unaware of any.
Okay. And will the migrant camp hurt or help the quality of the park and the services that are currently offered to visitors? And likewise, we talked a little bit about the migrant camp impact on the national parks ecosystem. I can't imagine that there's not going to be a big impact on that as well.
There would be absolutely a major impact on the park's ecosystem.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I realize our witnesses have been sitting at the table for a long time, and speaking of facilities at Floyd Bennett Field, I'm going to declare a 5-minute recess so that you can take a break, and we will plan to start back promptly in 5 minutes.
I'm gonna take 6.
Hearing will come to order. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Duarte. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this work? Wrong button. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of our guests here today testifying. I want to talk to Ms. Areola and Ms. Williams. Is this the first time that you ladies have had a chance to come to Capitol Hill and have our attention and explain what's happening in your districts?
For me, it has, yes.
And Ms. Williams, have you been able to find an opportunity to let us in Congress know how this influx of migration is impacting your district?
I am very thankful for the opportunity to be before you to bring to the attention the misuse or the intent of our national park.
Thank you. You represent districts there in New York. Please elucidate for us a little bit beyond just the national park issue. I'm reading reports, but one of the reasons of these hearings is to get firsthand accounts from folks on the ground throughout the country. What's happening to small businesses around the hotels where migrants are being housed and tourism is being displaced?
Small businesses both around and inside the hotels are closing.
On what scale? What are you seeing?
I would say on a large scale. They've been reporting it on the local news that they just cannot function because of the lack of tourism and the fact that there are so many migrants on the street and in the hotels.
Thank you. And Ms. Williams, what are you seeing along those lines? What other social and community impacts are the large influxes of migrants having? I assume the national park wasn't our first option in terms of where to put hordes of migrants. Where else have they been put, and what have the community impacts been so far in your district?
Did it again, sorry. I heard this on the news, and there was no prior communication from the powers be, and it was very concerning for our community. I have to say that the 59th Assembly District is a very peculiar district. It's a residential area. It's a transit desert. We do not have a train going through our community, period. Our community have some of the most green spaces in New York City, hence Floyd Bennett Field, right? So housing the migrants there, it's almost 2 to 3 miles from anything possible. And we have a mall there. And those people that run that mall, they're concerned because as the colder months come by, darkness comes earlier, right? So people are very concerned, small businesses are concerned, but again, the district that I represent is a very residential one with much of safety concerns at hand.
How about food outlets, services, jobs? Can you elucidate a few of those issues?
Well, as I said, it's a 2-mile radius from where they will be placed, or almost 3 mile. There is no jobs there. There is no food there. There is nothing there but institutions like Aviator and Fresh Meadow Farm for recreational purposes. So all these things will have to be brought in. For them to travel, they would have to travel out of Floyd Bennett Field to go into the bigger population where they can seek those amenities.
So we have a food desert. We have a jobs desert. So SNAP cards and work visas won't remedy these factors easily. We have a transportation problem. We don't have public transportation set up to move these folks to where they can be productive or participate in the economy. So what's the end game? What do we do as, I think this last month we had 230,000 new crossings documented on the southern border, plus gotaways, so we assume it's a higher number than that. What's the end game? How does this end? Because in my district in Modesto, we've got neighborhoods that were formed as, you call them refugee camps or Dust Bowl camps around Modesto, California, where the Model A's just came and parked and people started living there, and now we've got neighborhoods that sprawled up that, not quite 100 years later, 90 years later, that still have no sidewalks. They've never been incorporated. There never was a solution. And now we've got these ongoing problems of these communities that were never planned. How do you see this ending?
I just want to add, as you said, end game. I don't know if there's an end in sight, However, what I do know that needs to happen, that every part of government, federal, state, and city, have to be in communication. You cannot ignore the local government, the local representatives that represent their constituency. These decisions cannot be made at such a level where the local electeds read about it or hear about it over the news.
So have they asked you, has anyone asked you from the federal government as they displace onto the federal park here and other places throughout your community, how they're going to supplement the tax base that has been put, further demands have been put on? Are they going to give you as a city or state government additional revenues to handle the public safety or the lack of tax base that's coming with these new demands?
The gentleman's time's expired. I'll give you.
There has been no
brief more
commitment
attention.
for financial support.
Well, thank you for coming here today. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this incredibly important hearing and for you being willing to come in today to talk about these serious issues. Councilmember Areola, we are very interested in learning more about the public consultation process for Migrant Camp at Floyd Bennett Field. Just 2 weeks ago, the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee heard testimony from the Democratic witness about how important it was to, quote, facilitate meaningful public engagement in decision-making, end quote, and especially in, quote, communities of color, end quote, and, quote, low-income communities, end quote, during the NEPA process, because it will lead to, quote, better decisions for the entire community, end quote. Councilmember Areola, please briefly describe the public consultation process to host thousands of migrants at Floyd Bennett Field.
There was no public consultation no public consultation. There was a letter written to the president by our governor asking for Floyd Bennett. We then asked for a meeting with the governor's office. The governor's office did comply. A meeting was held. The governor was not present. We sent questions beforehand. None of the questions were answered. We followed up 2 weeks later for another meeting. That was on a Thursday. They told us no changes have happened. We don't need another meeting. And on Friday, the lease was signed.
That does not sound to be very meaningful in terms of public engagement or decision-making. Then are there communities of color or low-income communities in the area around Floyd Bennett Field and Gateway National Recreation Area that were consulted?
No, there were no areas at all, whether areas of color, low income, middle income, no areas, no communities, no elected officials. We found out like everyone else did.
So across the board, the Biden administration has totally failed at communicating and working with the community to address the crisis that the Biden administration has created. Is that fair?
It is fair to say he actually visited our city and flew in and out without meeting with the mayor or visiting a shelter.
So I would say that he is not engaged in a meaningful public engagement process. In the process, it seems to me that the Biden administration has also failed to engage with local communities of color, as we've already discussed, and other groups that are impacted by this throughout the area. Is that also fair?
That is correct.
Okay. As a result of the Biden administration not engaging in a meaningful consultation process, they reached a decision that harms your community and has caused great suffering for not only your community, but the people that they're bringing in. Isn't that true as well?
Yes, it is.
You know, Councilmember Areola and Ms. Williams, you've quoted the NEPA handbook where it says that, quote, actions taken in response to an emergency are not exempt from NEPA review, end quote. Now, as a NEPA attorney, I don't agree that this is the way that it should be. I think that there are many situations in my home state of Wyoming where we could have prevented a wildfire, a catastrophic wildfire, for example, if we had not been held up by the NEPA process. But I think it's worth highlighting the double standard that we're seeing here in relation to the invasion on the southern border and the invasion of our cities, such as in New York. If we want to respond to emergencies related to immediate risks of severe forest fire that devastate communities and people throughout my state, we can't expedite the process. Yet when the politics of the situation is magnified enough for the world to see the disaster that has been created by the Biden administration, then what happens? Exactly what's happening with the National Park Service and what you're suffering through in New York. How do you see the politics of this situation creating a double standard for the National Park Service, particularly as it relates to NEPA?
I think that they've given it no thought, no cause, and they're talking about protecting people, but they're not protecting the people that they want to place on Floyd Bennett Field without having these safeguards in place.
One of the things that I think has been so shocking to the American public is in watching the invasion on the southern border. And the southern states, Arizona, Texas, California, and even in my area, have been dealing with this crisis for quite some time. It is now visiting upon other areas, and it is exploding across our country. It isn't just affecting one national park, it's affecting every community, it's affecting every state, and it's affecting the nation as a whole. It's tearing apart the fabric of our society because of these failed policies. I am sorry for what the Biden administration has done to you, and I am sorry for what the Biden administration has done to our country. They should be ashamed of themselves. I very much appreciate your willingness to come here and tell us about the crisis they have created. Thank you.
Young lady's time's expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing this proud New Yorker to wave onto your committee this afternoon. And thank you as well for your leadership and commitment to this issue that is so important. There is no question from everything we've heard today and hearings that we've had across Capitol Hill over the last months that President Biden's failed immigration policies, his dereliction of duty alongside Secretary Mayorkas, has led to an unprecedented crisis at our border. And now that unprecedented crisis at our border is no longer at just our border, but it's at states throughout this country, like the great state of New York. And what baffles me the most is that during the campaigns of Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul, they praised the fact that certain areas were sanctuary cities. They were going to welcome everyone with open arms. And now we realize that there was actually no plan in place to be that sanctuary. It was just complete pandering for their base. There was no plan in place to have migrants sheltered correctly. There is no chance that migrants leaving their homes, risking their lives, leaving their families, coming to this country for a better way of life, coming to this country to achieve the American dream that so many of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have achieved. They never thought they were going to come into this country, and that American dream was going to be living in a vacant hangar at JFK Airport. That's not the American dream. What we've seen is that there were no plans in place, and now panic has set in. Just a few weeks ago, and it's probably the first and last thing that Mayor Adams and I will ever agree on, he said that this issue, the migrants coming into New York City, could, quote, destroy New York. In essence, the lights dimming on Broadway. And now what we see is you have a letter that many of you have referenced, a letter from Governor Kathy Hochul to President Biden asking for the use of places, national parks. There's also been talk of using military bases to house these migrants. Now, prior to becoming a member of Congress, I was proud to serve as a member of the greatest police department in the world, the NYPD. And I look back now on my brothers and sisters in blue who call Floyd Bennett Field essentially their office. Aviation, some of scuba, members of special operations, different specialized units within the NYPD who took an oath to protect and serve the Constitution, who took an oath to stand that line between good and evil. Not only did New York State and the democratic policies of this country legitimately take the handcuffs off of police and put it on, off of criminals and put it on police. But now they want to cut the budget. And now they have to share an office with migrants at Floyd Bennett Field. So, Councilwoman, I ask you, New York City is going to face unprecedented budget cuts. Mayor Adams has said 15% over the next 9 months in agencies that are dealing with these migrants the most. And if this was asked already, I apologize. But what do you see, and Ms. Williams, what do you see as the results that are going to face New York City as a result of these budget cuts and the changes being made in New York City because of the unprecedented levels of migrants, because of the failed policies of Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas?
The 15% cuts that are being spoken about between now and April will reduce our essential services, fire department, NYPD, the DSNY, education, all the different things that we need to keep our city going. And if we don't have NYPD and we don't have overtime, we don't have extra patrols because we have a diminished police force. If we don't have overtime for our firefighters, we don't have firefighters on every shift. And we have a very big problem with the migrants and their motor scooters with their lithium-ion batteries.
We sure do. And just, I don't want to cut you off, but just one last thing because my time is running out. It's estimated that in 2024, and I believe this number is going to be higher, that it's going to cost the city close to $5 billion with a B dollars for migrants. And in 2025, that number is going to be higher. It's going to be close to $8 billion. We had a Homeland Security hearing, and I'm sure there's some members of this committee that sat here earlier. Those numbers are higher than their entire state's budget. It's baffling. And Mayor Adams is right. This issue, this problem that's being created by President Biden and Mayorkas is going to destroy New York City and many other cities throughout this country. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for allowing me to wave on. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Hunt, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. Really, really appreciate you all being here. Thank you for your time. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Behind me, you see a picture that speaks for itself. This is what I call sheer chaos. And by the way, this photo was captured in 2021. A little background on me. I'm a combat veteran, deployed to Baghdad in 2006. That's about what it looked like when I was there in a combat zone. This is what happens when you refuse to control our border and our sovereign nation. We're overrun by cartels trafficking in migrants, drugs, and crime. These are all realities in Joe Biden's America, except now they're being felt well beyond our border states like mine in Texas. It's not just Republicans sounding the alarm now. This is happening with Democrats as well. Next picture. Mayor Eric Adams, as we've heard a few of the congressmen say on August 22nd about New York, I'm proud that this is the right to shelter state, and we're going to continue that. That's the leader of the largest cities in America. And if you remember in 2022, he even met migrants as they entered New York. Let's fast forward to May 2023, and Mayor Adams, through executive order, has suspended the law he was so proud of. And it seems that even Democrats are starting to see the light. It only gets real when it's in your backyard. This is something that we've been experiencing in Texas for the past few years. We've had 6.5 million people enter our country illegally at our southern border. This is the most we've seen in my lifetime. It's absolute chaos. It's a crisis. I get text messages every single week from people finding dead bodies on their ranches. And yet we sit by here and do nothing with this current administration. Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. And I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York. Those are his words. Next up, Kathy Hochul, the governor from the great state of New York. In December 2021, Governor Hochul said, and I quote, As you know, the Statue of Liberty is inscribed, and it says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. You're welcome with open arms, and we'll work to keep you safe." Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of her teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beyond the golden door. That's actually what it says. And I know it by heart because I learned it when I was a child. That's what this country is all about. This is actually what I fought for. So please, no, I'm not xenophobic. I love my country. I want to die for it. My parents took me to the Statue of Liberty and made me memorize that. This is not that. This is a disgrace. Do not try to pawn this off as if this is Ellis Island and people that are trying to come to this country to find a better way for themselves, because right now, we ain't got it. Don't do that to me. Don't insult my intelligence, and don't insult the intelligence of the American people. Now that we have these people coming here en masse, it's go somewhere else. Can't sit here, seats taken. All of a sudden, the governor turns into Forrest Gump. And in Biden's America, from it seems like to me, for him, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And that's the way he's governing our country right now. We don't even know what we're going to get. But now the governor is saying, if you're thinking of coming to New York, we are truly out of space. And you're going to leave your country, so go somewhere else. This is what happens when we don't abide by the laws that we have already set in our country. Are we a sovereign nation or not? Are we a nation of laws or not? This has now become the United States of lawlessness. Ma'am, you talked about, Ms. Williams, I saw your testimony earlier on TV, ma'am. You said you don't want this to be political. I hate to break it to you. Unfortunately, it is. And if you can't see the dichotomy between what we are saying on this side of the dais and our colleagues on the left, pay attention, ma'am. I wish this wasn't a political issue, to be honest with you. I wish we can all agree that having 6.5 million people enter our country illegally is not a sustainable model. We cannot afford it. We bring in $5 trillion a year from the American taxpayer, the hardworking American taxpayer, and we're spending $7 trillion and then bringing in 6 million people that we can't afford. Enough is enough. And that's why we have hearings like this, to elucidate the American public, to let them know we are fighting tirelessly just for our country. We are not xenophobic. Trust me, I'm not racist. I just want my country back. Thank you all so much for being here. I yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, who he and I were able to be in New York City last week. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman, Councilwoman Areola, and Assemblywoman Williams. Thanks for your hospitality. We certainly appreciate it. You know, are you familiar, you're both politicians, so are you familiar with good process builds good policy, builds good politics? Are you familiar with that?
Sure.
So why I bring that up is that when you go through a process properly, you get people on to come together and come up with some ideas. And so the other side just harassed you about what's your idea. Wouldn't that have been done at a meeting where you got all the interested stakeholders together? You know, you have no idea what can be proposed. Would you agree with that, Councilwoman?
I would agree that if more people were included in the conversation, there could have been a better solution.
Do you agree with that, Assemblywoman?
100%.
So the power is really at that local level, right?
Yes.
It doesn't come from the federal government, it doesn't come from the state, it comes from the local people. I think that makes a big, big difference. And so I think that there's so many opportunities that we never get a chance to see because we don't go through that consultation process. The other side talks about a process about NEPA and EA and EISs. And yet we don't want to do that here when the federal government wants to throw a bunch of people on a tarmac, so to speak, in a national park. It's really, really sad. One of the things I wanted to ask you is that you saw a lot of this rigmarole going on and you're attacked. If I asked you, what was the one question that you wish you had been asked, and what is its answer? Would you please give me that and start down with Ms. Areola and then go to Assemblywoman Williams, all the way down the line. Go ahead, Lisa.
I wish I would have been asked why in the letter to Mr. Majorca. I said that I did not approve of temporary work authorization, because I would have said it's because there are tens of thousands of immigrants who are here now who have been waiting for years to get their work authorization so that they can work and pay taxes and become part of our economic engine and tax engine, who have been pushed back that others have now jumped the line.
You said there's a right way and a wrong way, right? Thank you. Yes, Ms. Williams.
I agree with what my colleague said. You know, that poses a very big thing, because then you're putting one against another. And this is not what we stand for. And then also to not have public hearing, not to have local government like myself, the council member, at the table when it's in our backyard and our constituency is very, very concerned. This is an issue when there is no communication.
Ms. Acer?
Thank you. I would have liked to have had a chance to talk more about how getting work authorization to asylum seekers and migrants can make a key difference, and will. I think in the coming weeks, we'll see, as more and more people actually have access to these work permits, it will be a boon to New York City. New York City is not going to be destroyed. I lived there. My grandparents were immigrants that lived in New York City. I have faith in New York City. It's going to be totally fine.
Yes. Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, sir. My question would just be for the National Park Service and the Department of Interior, why we really weren't invited to the table with planning any of the law enforcement aspects that went into this. This lease, all 61 pages of it, has mentions U.S. Park Police one time, yet they also say that we're going to be the sole responsibility, holding the sole responsibility for law enforcement actions that occur outside of the premises on our park, on our jurisdiction. So my question would be why the U.S. Park Police weren't consulted during the planning of this lease.
By the way, have you ever seen a 2,200 person, adult, male, military-age man camp that actually works very well? I've never seen that, even the oil patch. We have never seen anything go like that. And we're going to intersperse this with the playgrounds and the fields and soccer fields. There's no way in hell this is going to actually work. And that's why I came back to my first statement. Good process builds good policy, builds good politics, and none of it was followed here. Federal government doesn't do any of that. The other thing, the one last thing I want to make a point to is on these work permits. Remember, these people are going to the front of the line. And so what ends up happening, you have people coming here legally. They should have the first say in that aspect. And a lot of these people have been waiting over months, years to try to get these work permits. So when you see people going to the front of the line, wrong answer. I don't think it helps anybody. I think it causes mischief and it causes disparaging comments about each other. Mr. Chairman, I will yield back and I want to say thank you.
Gentlemen, as time has expired, the chair recognizes the ranking member. Mr. Grijalva, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Sear, let me begin. Let me begin by quoting comment. Every city in America has become a border city. Drugs and criminals, including hundreds of terrorists, are pouring into our backyards. Our schools and hospitals are overrun with illegals. Police forces are overwhelmed as progressive mayors slash their budgets. Our streets are not safe. Fentanyl is rampant. Police officers are being assaulted. Cartels are thriving. This is representative in a report of tweets, quotes, public comments that have been made on the subject of asylum seekers, refugees, and the border and immigration in general. You mentioned in your testimony that how rhetoric describing migrants as threats or invaders fuels violence against certain groups, especially racial and ethnic minorities. Instead of having a hearing that fuels violence, what real solutions should Congress be focusing on? And let me add to that, the alternative being proposed by the Republican majority is H.R. 2. And I think it is a messaging bill. It has the probability of it becoming law is 0. So there is a consensus moment that we could look at what are common sense solutions on this issue. So reference that, and also the issue of rhetoric, if you don't mind.
Yes, thank you very much, Ranking Member. Greatly appreciate it. H.R. 2 is not a solution. It's just the opposite. If people are fleeing a burning building, it's not a solution to lock the door and prevent them from fleeing. All it does is endanger lives and force people to start jumping out of windows. Efforts to prevent people from seeking refuge will just force them to more dangerous routes. The H.R. 2 bill that the House has passed codifies some of the most horrific policies of recent years, including, in effect, codifying a version of the Title 42 policy, as well as the Remain in Mexico policy. Teams of researchers in my organization, me myself, repeatedly visited with asylum seekers subjected to those policies. We've had teams at the border in recent weeks and months. People who are forced to wait in Mexico under these policies, people who are denied access, sufficient access to ports of entry, face life-threatening conditions. They are being targeted specifically. These policies have actually put them at risk by forcing them to wait in areas where cartels target them for kidnappings, torture. My staff is just overwhelmed by what happens. Humanitarian workers now are in danger increasingly. These policies are not a solution, they are a problem. And they're not effective from a migration management perspective either. They encourage repeat entries, they force populations that generally went to ports of entry to cross instead. I mean, you should look, if you want to really look at good solutions, look at the shift that's happened with Haitian asylum seekers who now are coming to ports of entry because of the steps that have been taken by the Biden administration. That's an example of an effective policy. It's also been incredibly, I could go on and on about that, but I can,
Not unique. I'm first generation American, privilege of serving in this Congress from southern Arizona along the border. That's where I grew up. That's the area I represent, and live the issue day in, day out. I don't need to go to the border, take a photo op, and then say, look, I care about the border. But the fact remains that this complex, difficult issue that requires political courage on all sides has to be resolved. And the issue that we're seeing in New York City is a response to an emergency, a response to not having the system in place and the resources to do this correctly. A schizophrenic policy back and forth from hardline to more humanitarian, back to hardline, back and forth, back and forth. And so there's been no consistency as well, and I blame all the administrations for that. But this issue is a precursor, I believe, it's very transparent, that everything, all the hearings that we've seen from all the committees, including this one now, on this issue, is to tee up the ball so that when we finish the hostage negotiations on whether, after the government closes down, that some of the elements, some of the most dire elements in H.R. 2 will suddenly appear as part of the compromise and part of the law. That's the strategy, that's the agenda, it's transparent, it's a mistake, and we once again will avoid a comprehensive, complex solution that is needed very desperately. I'm proud of the area I represent. It's a wonderful land, wonderful people, and we owe it to them and to every citizen and every person in this country to solve this critical domestic issue that we're not solving. With that, I yield back, and I guess I'll leave now, I'm done, you know.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for questioning. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your time and your patience today. Also want to personally thank Councilwoman and Assemblywoman for visiting in New York with the group that came last week, for your passion about this issue and for your willingness to come here to DC and testify. Mr. Spencer, I wish we'd have had a chance to talk to you when I was at Floyd Bennett Field last week. I think you could have shed some additional light on the issue. And, you know, you can tell there's a lot of passion around this issue. This hearing is about building migrant camps on Floyd Bennett Field, but it obviously has far-reaching effects all the way to the southern border throughout many parts of our government. We can't solve those issues here today. As much as I would like to solve those issues. But we do know there's a reason why there's a flood of migrants into New York City. But Mr. Spencer, had you been there last week, I think you could have added to the questions that we asked. When we were meeting with New York City officials and Park Service officials, the question was raised about security and safety if these migrant camps were built. We were assured at one point by New York City officials that they would take care of security around the migrant camp. I'm going to move over to Ms. Areola for just a moment. How's the funding for supplying that additional security? Where are those officers going to come from?
It's about to be cut by 15%.
Mr. Spencer, they assured us that this campsite would be secure. But in the course of conversation, they mentioned something about the migrants are free to come and go. They can't be held there. So we were up in the control tower, and you could see the place they were saying they were going to build the camp, and then you could look over and see the playground. I asked the question, so a migrant can walk out, and these are, as has been mentioned, single adult males. They could freely walk out of the migrant camp, walk down the street, and walk in the playground. And I was told that was a hypothetical question. Had you been involved in the planning process, had NEPA not been shortcut, is this the kind of issue you would have looked at? And is that a hypothetical question?
Thank you, sir. That question is definitely something I would have brought up if I was able to attend last week. That is one of our concerns. The fact that camp is going to be put, like I said before, right next to a youth complex where there's going to be lots of children is definitely concerning as a law enforcement aspect. And the fact that we also haven't been from our union anyway, we haven't been given the opportunity to bring up our safety concerns with the officers either. 2 officers on a day-to-day basis is already unsafe as it is, in my opinion, to monitor that area. And now you're going to add 2,000 more people in a tent in probably some pretty detrimental living conditions. And when they're able to, they come and go as they please. That's going to be our responsibility, the U.S. Park Police. NYPD were gracious enough to give some officers to take care of the inside of the tent, the facility itself, but we are going to be the ones that are responsible for everything that happens outside of that tent area.
And just to be clear, that does cause you concern.
It's very concerning to us.
And also, I know as the leader of the Park Fraternal Order of Police that you're able to come here and testify. Do you believe there's other Park Service employees that would fear retribution if they were to speak out? Do you sense that there are others in the Park Service that are not comfortable with this decision?
I would imagine there are probably more employees in the Park Service. I can definitely tell you that there are employees in my agency that would love to speak out about this, but they'd be in fear of what would happen with their career.
Thank you, sir. So as we visited the park and I was learning more about it, I was fascinated that a facility like this existed in such a populated area, and that, you know, 1 million people a year visit this park. And looking at the park map, it showed the area actually where the migrant shelters are going to be built is labeled as a grasslands restoration project, and in parentheses underneath that on the map, it said public access denied. I know the Audubon Society has done work there. There's an ecology village. There's all the other recreational opportunities. And, you know, it bothered me to hear that referred to as just an airport in Brooklyn. I live in a national park, and that would be very offensive to me if somebody said it was just a bathhouse in Arkansas. There's a lot of pride in the local communities where these parks exist, but to me that's just an indication of how this whole situation is being viewed, that it's just an airport in Brooklyn. Who cares if we build a few migrant shelters on it? I'm going to give the two local authorities in Brooklyn an opportunity to talk about that and to make any final closing comments you would like to. We'll start with you first, Ms. Areola.
The comments were very, very insulting because we all love our parkland, we all love our green space, and it may not look like Yellowstone or anything else in any other state. It's ours. And it is not just a rundown runway. It is a place where people go and enjoy, up to 1 million people per day. And it's where schools go, and schools have their after-school recreational athletic fields, and they play there. It's where people have a community garden. It is a place of community for the surrounding communities. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk, you know, Ms. Acer said about, you know, organizations doing their job and getting people asylum, you know, status. But if that were the case, why is Kathy Hochul employing the National Guard to work as social workers to make sure that their paperwork goes through? And what happened to our homeless population that were New Yorkers prior to the migrants coming into this? Have they evaporated? Have our veterans, homeless veterans, have they evaporated? Such focus is being given to this that all the other issues that New Yorkers are facing have just gone to the wayside. But we are stretched so thin that we're now looking at national parks that are not safe. If anyone saw the video that played earlier, Assemblymember Williams was there. She was in 10 inches of water. That's not on a hurricane. That's on a light rainfall. It is unsafe to put the migrants there. It is unsafe for anyone to be there. We've said it from the start. This is not any type of NIMBY type of ask. This is bipartisan. This is what it should be. A Republican and a Democrat who are working together to make sure that the integrity of their park remains what it should be as a national park. The surrounding communities remain as they should be, able to enjoy that park, and that the migrants, the homeless, and those who are seeking asylum are tended to. But we can't continue to do it because there is no more room at the inn, and our borders are not closing, and unless they do, we are going to continue to be overrun, and it won't just be New York, it'll be every city in every state across America. Thank you for the time. Thank you for coming to see our national park, and thank you for hosting this session for us, this hearing.
Assemblywoman Williams, thank you for your passion to speak out on this. I didn't introduce you as a Democrat member of the New York General Assembly, but it's been established here in the discussions. Any closing remarks and
Yes,
about just an airport in Brooklyn?
Thank you so very much. And we had to travel all the way from the southern side of Brooklyn to hear that our national park is just a regular runway. Well, that might be your opinion, and we've heard many opinions float around this room today. However, our visit here to Congress is to talk about using what we call our national park, the misuse and the intent to house 2,000 plus men. We talk about protected fields there. In every area of Floyd Bennett Field, there is signage. And the signage says, area closed, do not enter. It's a natural resource protection area. Violators are subjected to be fined. Grassland habitat management area. The following activities are prohibited: entry, kite flying, pets, fires. We've heard from Mr. Spence, 2 officers. How are you going to man 2,000 individuals there and to keep them off the grass? Not to mention, there are other things floating around. Right across the street, we have a very big area, Bottle Beach, that is contaminated with radiation, that is closed off. What is to say that they won't end up on that side of the beach? So we have to be very vigilant of what it is we're saying. Myself and my colleague here, we come together in a bipartisan effort because our community have a voice. And the one thing that I did not say, when they spoke earlier about low income and communities of color, in the 5th 9th Assembly District, 70% of our population is Black. Another 25 to almost 30% is white. So we really need to do our homework, and probably if they came into our communities to do a public assessment or to hear from individuals, you would see the diversity of our community. And as taxpayers, we should be concerned about what is happening in our backyard. As parents, we should be concerned about the safety of our children. So I applaud you, Chairman, to having us here on this platform to talk about our natural resources and how our natural resources, our national park, is being used as a pawn and is not being said for what it is. We're supposed to be ambassadors of our national parks. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. You never got asked the question, but have you worked at other national parks other than Gateway?
No, Mr. Chairman. I actually am based out of here in D.C. We only have 3 field offices: D.C., New York, and San Francisco.
How do you think it makes the law enforcement officers feel at Gateway to hear their park called just an airport in Brooklyn?
I don't believe my members who are proud New Yorkers up there would appreciate that comment, but that's okay.
Thank you. The ranking member, I believe, has an announcement.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter some documents into the record having to do with the text of NEPA's emergency process, the historic uses of Floyd Bennett Field, to dispel some of the environmental review and the myths about the park and environmental review. Report from Cato, Drug Enforcement Administration, and PR that lay out the facts about fentanyl and drug trafficking. Newsflash: asylum seekers are not responsible. It's organized crime on both sides of the border. And a GAO report on the wall. And finally, the budget recommendations, the continuing resolution, and the approach to deal with issues of the Park Service, including enforcement. And I can't do anything, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for the indulgence. I can't do anything to take away the damaging nativist and racist rhetoric that permeates and infects this issue and keeps it from being really discussed and dealt with. But at least my effort to make sure that the record has some information that's rooted in reality and fact. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and I'll also be submitting to the record, and without objection, your stuff can be submitted. I'll be submitting to the record an accounting of the national disaster emergency that was declared for Floyd Bennett Field when it was used in an emergency situation for other purposes, and how there were denial of FEMA trailers to be located there for housing after that national emergency declaration. Also, we'll be submitting additional information to the record on the funding of the National Park Service and the fact that those numbers have gone up, and this administration asked for budget cuts far beyond what have been included in the rescissions in the Interior Appropriations Bill that hasn't been debated on the floor yet. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony and the members who were here for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on October 2nd. The hearing record will be open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee is adjourned.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.